Hi, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes, Zoel.
All right, ma'am.
Sneha?
Am I audible now?
Yes.
Hello. Yes. May I begin, ma'am? I'm sorry, ma'am. You're not
Yes,
audible.
please. Yeah.
All right, ma'am. The rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened. John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, said that. Good afternoon, dear participants. Father Gerald D'Souza, Pauline ma'am, Sneha ma'am, the esteemed guest speakers, and respected faculty of the St. Joseph's College of Law. My name is Zoeb Rizwan Talkani, and we are holding today's event in honor of International Human Rights Day. Over to you, Sneha.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sneha Sampson, and on behalf of Nivaran, it brings me great joy to welcome everyone today for Day 5 of the Human Rights Week, titled Insaaniyat, the documentary making competition. Back to you, Zoe.
Thank you, Sneha. I would like to welcome you all today to today's ceremony. It has been an exhilarating week, filled with events that were not only exciting, but also educative in their nature. Today will be the concluding event to our Human Rights Week, and we will be announcing the winners of all the competitions towards the end.
Yes, and it is now my pleasure to introduce our director, Father Gerald D'Souza. Father Gerald D'Souza is the former director of Ashirwad, Bangalore. He has been at the forefront of mobilizing people and groups and has been actively engaged in working with NGOs to champion the cause of the poor. Father, we kindly request you to address the audience.
Good evening, one and all. Friends, we have gathered here under the theme All Human, All Equal, on the occasion of International Human Rights Day. It's very significant to celebrate this day as we witness, as we see around the growing rate of human rights violations. Some sociologists even claim inequality is real and equality is a myth. Therefore, don't be worried to make things which are unequal by nature equal. This is the theory, of course, and we are not entitled to subscribe it. At the same time, we see today the human rights violations are justified. They are made it to appear normal. What is wrong with these violations? I mean, they are bound to happen, and they were, and they will. So this is the language that is being spoken. Moreover, they are also institutionalized. There is a set pattern of human rights violations, and a particular category of people are victimized. And this pattern also is very much visible. In such context, we are observing this Human Rights Day. Therefore, my dear students, I would like you to look at from two dimensions this very celebration or perhaps observation of this Human Rights Day. One thing is to have a good, sound and logical framework of human rights. Human rights at times is perceived to be very subjective, but I think there are no standard framework where we can understand universally. And that is what we are trying to perceive, trying to understand, and try to integrate. I repeat, a good, a sound, and a logical framework of human rights. Secondly, that is not enough for knowing a legal or perhaps human rights framework. We need to have an integral approach. Ultimately, it should end up with the change of values, attitudes, and definitely it needs to translate into action. These two things should go simultaneously, and that change or perhaps transformation of understanding and change of our attitudes and values should take place simultaneously in our life. It is not an event, therefore, to observe and to forget and go on our way. As you are aware, SJCL, St. Joseph's College of Law, vows to abide by these principles of human rights, especially upholding liberty and dignity of every individual. Today, we have an apt resource person with us in Arvind Narayan. He is an academician as well as an activist, a rare combination that we find in our society today. I'm sure he will facilitate this thinking process for us. Thank you, Mr. Arvind, for joining us this evening. I also acknowledge the initiative of our Human Rights Cell, Nivaran of SJCL, Ms. Aishwarya and Lindsay, the staff coordinators, and the student coordinators, Riya, Karthik, and Main, and Zoeb and Sneha, the moderators of this program. Once again, good wishes of the day. Let us continue to reflect on the principles of human rights. The principles of human rights be part of our life, part of our culture, part of our thinking, our ideology, and moreover, practice. Thank you, and God bless us all.
Thank you for your knowledgeable words, respected Father. We could not agree with you more. Now, we would like to welcome our guest speaker, Mr. Arvind Narayan, to today's event. To speak for today's event. He has done his bachelor's in law from NLS Bangalore, followed by a master's in the University of Warwick on a Chevening scholarship. Sir's areas of interest and expertise lie in constitutionalism, human rights, legal history, and queer rights. He is currently in the process of doing his PhD on mapping the elements of an Ambedkarite jurisprudence at NLSIU. He is a reputed author and TEDx speaker, and was also part of the team of lawyers challenging Section 377 of the IPC right from the High Court in 2009 to the Supreme Court in 2018. Sir is currently a visiting faculty at the Azim Premji University School of Public Policy and Governance. Mr. Arvind Narayan, it is a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you, Zoeb, for that very kind introduction, and thank you, Father Gerald, for your very, very kind words. And it's a pleasure to be here, even if virtually, at the forum of the St. Joseph's College of Law, and to mark the anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Because why is December 10th a day of significance as far as human rights is concerned? It's a matter of significance as far as human rights is concerned, because that's the day when the General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Again, if you ask the question, why did they adopt a Declaration on Human Rights, and is there any meaning to this, words? Again, what is the meaning of words? Do words have meaning beyond the text on which they're written? Or is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights irrelevant the moment the ink on the paper dried? And I think I'd argue that we have to understand the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as really the product of a certain history. And if we see the Declaration as a product of that history, then it begins to have a lot more meaning in our eyes. And I think all of you who have some sense, familiarity with global history, which I'm sure the students of St. Joseph's College of Law have, clearly the UDHR is really a product of the struggle against Nazi domination. And it's a product of the struggle against the values which the Nazis represented. And if you ask what are the values which the Nazis represented, I think the fundamental value they stood for is obviously the supremacy of the Germanic race over all the other subject races. So in effect, what the argument the Nazis set up, or the principle that they waged aggressive war against the rest of the world, was really the idea that the German race is a superior race, which by implication meant other races are inferior races. And the logical endpoint of this particular line of thinking, where you see that there's a hierarchical relationship between human beings or between human races, is that some races should live either in a subordinate relationship with the German race, and other races should be eliminated because they had no place in the Germany or in a German supremacist imagination or a Nazi imagination. So, in a sense, if we go back to the history of World War II and go back to what was really what was one of the motivating impulses of the fight against the Nazis, both within Germany and outside Germany, is really a struggle against the idea that there is one man, one value, or one person, one value, and the idea that that human beings have a value, intrinsic value, in and of themselves. Father Gerald alluded to the idea of dignity, that every human being is endowed with the idea of dignity. And if you take the logical end point again of the Nazi regime, it's clearly was in what is referred to as the Holocaust, which is the planned and programmatic killing of over 6 million Jews, the the elimination of a range of other races they considered subject races, including the Poles and a range of other races in Eastern Europe, as well as waging a war against human diversity. They, in particular, took on, eliminated, in terms of just a matter of historical record, that the gas which was used against the Jews in Nazi Germany was really first used against the disabled in, uh, in Nazi Germany. So the disabled grouping was the first grouping to experience the war the Nazis waged against human diversity. Then there was, of course, the war they waged against the communists, who were again a political grouping subjected to elimination by the Nazis. Among the first groupings sought to be eliminated by the Nazis, the war they waged against the homosexual subculture, which again was among the first groupings to be eliminated by the Nazis, and of course the Jews and a range of other populations they considered subject populations. So the point being, World War II ends. The end of World War II, what happens is the world comes together, literally the world comes together, and says that what happened as far as what the Nazis did to human beings can't be allowed to happen to any human being anymore. And so the world comes up with the idea of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I think the fundamental principle of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is really captured in Article 1, which basically says uh, that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And this is in a sense, the framing argument of the UDHR, of the Universal Declaration, that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Let's see if we can try and get together some what meaning of what each of these phrases mean. So you get a sense of, in a sense, the significance of the UDHR. Why is the UDHR significant, right? And part of the argument, just hold your horses a little bit here, because part of the argument why a universal declaration is relevant is because why I went a little bit into history is to give you a sense of the significance of the declaration. But significance of the declaration not as a historical document, but significance of declaration is a live document. I think it's up to, again, it's the act of human imagination, which says that I've described to you in some detail of what the Nazis did to subject populations. You exercise your imagination and think, what does that mean for the various places which you're living in? What does it mean for you to live in India, to think of what the Nazis did? What does it mean for you to be in any other part of the world and think of what the Nazis did? I'll give you one example, one literary example, which I think is to me was quite fascinating. Is if you get a chance, read a book. It's a very easy book to read. It's a book written by Percival Abzar Nafizi called "Reading Lolita in Tehran." Lolita is a book of fiction, and it's seen as, in a sense, seen a decadent work of American fiction. And what she charts out is really fantastic. Is at the height of the Iranian Revolution, the book, which is very very popular among her students, she was a literature teacher, among her students in Tehran, was Lolita. And she's asking the question why. How did this book, which speak to the experience of the Iranian students, and the point she's making, this is the power of, again, what she calls the power of imagination. You should be able to see in Lolita an exemplar of where your world is today. And take another example of a book she gives. I'll just mention one more book which I think is important. She also talks about another classic of American literature called Huckleberry Finn, which if you haven't read, you must read. Because the Huckleberry Finn, the story is really this, in very, very, very brief terms. The story is this: about how Huck helps a slave to escape, right? And you think that, here's this guy, this white guy, doing this really wonderful good deed as far as the slave Jim is concerned. But Huck's conscience actually tells him that what he's doing is wrong. So all of his society tells him that helping a slave is wrong. So he says that, I should give up the slave I should give up Jim, my best friend at this moment, and give him up to the authorities because that's what my conscience tells me to do. He says, but I went against my conscience, I went against my society, and I helped him to escape. That's what he does finally, but he does it with a bad conscience. He says, no, I've done something wrong. Right? Think of this as how does something like Huckleberry Finn speak to your contemporary context, right? And I'm leaving this to you as a question, just saying that you have to think imaginatively from historical context and think of your own context, and that's really the way we have to think of law and think of literature. Again, law. I'll make one last point on law over here. When again going back to the Nazi Holocaust, post that we know that we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We also have the drafting of the Nuremberg Statute. And Nuremberg Statute or the Nuremberg Charter, the International Military Tribunal's Charter, is under which the Nazi war criminals are tried for what is called crimes against humanity and war crimes. They're tried, and those who are found executed, a lot of the people who are complicit in the genocide or the killings managed to escape. So in 1960s, if you've read a novel called by Frederick Fawcett, I think it's called Day of the Jackal, where you'll see the story of a person called Adolf Eichmann, who is really who's kind of who's living in Argentina. He's been a part of the Nazi Holocaust. He's escaped and is living in Argentina. The Israeli force, the Mossad, abducts him in act of what is called kidnapping, right, which is a violation of international law, etc. Takes him to Israel, and they try him for crimes against the Jewish people. The point I want to make here is only one, actually. There are many, many questions we can go into. I won't go into all of them. Just one point, which is when he's tried for crimes against the Jewish people, Hannah Arendt, who again is a person, if you get a chance, you should read her, in a fantastic book called Eichmann in Jerusalem, she makes the point that he was tried for crimes against the Jewish people. That's a fundamental mistake. He should have been tried for what she says are crimes against humanity committed on the body of the Jewish people. It's a very significant and a very poignant statement because the point she's making is this, is that the idea of law is that if today somebody is a victim of your crime, tomorrow other people could be victims of your crime, of the same crime. So once you phrase it as crimes against the Jewish people, you narrow it down and you say that the only possible victims of this particular crime are Jews. But in reality, a range of other groupings can be victims. So if you take that idea, of course, if you say crimes against humanity, then arguably today the Palestinian people are the victims of crimes against humanity committed by the Jewish state, committed by the Israeli state in this case. But if you say crimes against the Jewish people, then you narrow it down immediately. So the point, getting back to this, the value of the UDHR is the language of universality. Any grouping, any human grouping, can find its concerns and its problems and its difficulties reflected in the language of this particular declaration. And that is its importance. Philosophically, the importance of the UDHR, it can speak to humankind in any context, any culture, any possible situation. And that is the value that it has in terms of holding out a lens, saying that, we have this right as well, that nobody can deny us of this right. And look at what are the rights we have. I want to get a little bit into that. If you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I just mentioned Article 1, the critical article, says all persons. Again, the language, all persons, right? It's all you have to do to qualify for human rights is to be a person. A person is all you have to be, which is that you have to be born in some sense, a human being, and you're entitled to rights. It's not such citizens. Again, in terms of, since you're law students, the language is very, very important. It's not such citizens. Coming today, it's not such man. It doesn't say woman, right? It says person. As the most broad and most inclusive category, is the language of personhood. And so that's a very, very important and significant starting point, which is persons. All persons are born free and equal in dignity and rights. What does freedom mean, right? What do you mean by being free? And this the UDHR elaborates in great detail, but I'll just go to some of these parts which are absolutely vital to the notion of freedom. Uh, when we say freedom, what do you mean? Is it freedom of speech? What do you mean? Is it freedom of expression? What do you mean? Is the freedom of conscience? And what do you mean is the freedom of association and the freedom of assembly? These are the critical, absolutely critical freedoms which go out to an exercise of which makes you human. Right? And so if there is something which makes you human, it is the ability to be free. It's the ability to express yourself in your own thoughts, in your own mind. Right? And I'll give you one example of again, what does this idea of freedom of thought actually mean? If you go to the privacy judgment, which is the Puttaswamy judgment by 9 judges of the Supreme Court, again, as lawyers, you must read that. It's a long judgment, and most of my colleagues and friends will complain, saying, "Oh, 500 pages, how can I write for so long? It's very difficult to read." But as law students, I submit you have no option but to read it, right? And anyway, the point about the privacy judgment is at one point, Chandrachud makes a Justice Chandrachud makes a very important observation. He says, what is the value of privacy? Right? He says privacy is that space that you have when you know that nobody is looking over your shoulder, allows you to cultivate your faculties, your sense of being, your artistic expressions, your need to write, a range of things which emerge in that act of privacy. If you're thinking of it in terms of literature, again, if you think of Virginia Woolf's book, A Room of One's Own, which is an argument for how do you foster creativity as far as it's one of the early feminist texts. How do you foster creativity as far as women are concerned? She says all women need is a room of their own. And what does she mean by room of one's own? It's not just a physical space. It's also a space where you're not subject to that pressure. In this case, the husband coming in and saying, "Are you looking after the child? Are you cooking? Are you doing this?" No, none of that. A room of one's is a physical space, is a mental space for you to be creative. If you're asking the question, why haven't women written so many books? Virginia Woolf answers that. She says they've not been given that mental space or the physical space to be creative and to write and to express themselves. So the idea of thought is a central freedom, right? And the idea of thought is impinged not just by the state, but fundamentally by society. So if you look at the question of gender in Woolf's description, in Virginia Woolf's description, the idea of women being free is not a part of our culture. It's not a part of our society. It's not in our homes, it's not in our societies, right? And we know that. And so how do you cultivate the ability to be free to express oneself? And that's a fundamental challenge. Again, see, the idea of human rights is not out there. It's here. It's how do we cultivate that sense of freedom ourselves? How do we understand other people's aspirations to freedom? And how do we recognize the fact that this aspiration is there wherever we are and we allow for that expression? So the idea of freedom of thought is fundamental. Then thought, of course, leads to expression, right? What's the value of thought if we can't express yourself? And expression, again, comes in with so many limitations. And so the idea, again, if you want to take a contemporary example, I think the best example of expression is really Munawar Faruqi. What does he say? He's saying, I'm an artist. He's saying, I do this, the idea of stand-up comedy. That's my art form. That's my way of thinking. Actually, I love to express myself. And if you think of it from the point of view of the UDHR, it's your fundamental right to be free. Freedom is not just a negative freedom, saying that there's no constraints on me in terms of where I go. It's also a positive freedom, where freedom is a part of the expression of the human personality. Again, if you receive Munawar's statement, it's a very poignant, very beautiful, a very moving statement, right? What does he say? He says, comedy is my life, right? That's who I am. I become human through doing my stand-up comedy. So if you don't allow me the freedom to express, then I'm not human, right? And so that's the value, the freedom of opinion, of expression. So we're talking about freedom of expression, freedom of thought. Then you talk about the freedom of assembly, right? This is again very important. What is the freedom? Let's first association and assembly. What is the freedom of association, right? Again, it's very important because when you talk about the freedom of association, what we recognize fundamentally is that if I want to change the situation around me, I can change it only in association with other people. change, end of the day, is not a question of something which can be driven by me as an individual. I mean, it can in some instances, but it's fundamentally driven by me forming an association. Either recognize, unrecognized, how we choose to frame it. Association, I mean by me meeting of minds, cutting across many lines, saying that, I have found this idea, I want to take this idea forward. And that's something the law should recognize, because that's a fundamental part of your freedom. Unless you have the right to associate, you're not totally free. You're not free as a human being, because human beings, at the end of the day, are social beings, and we really emerge in that context of being with other people. Uh, I'll give you maybe one other example of this idea of association and how important it is. Again, as law students, I suggest, if you get a chance, look at this documentary called The Advocate, which is on the life of this human rights lawyer who's very important, fundamentally important human rights lawyer from India called Kanabira, right? And in that documentary, which is a fantastic documentation of his work, he's talking about what it would mean to do lawyering during the time of the emergency. The interview with him and his wife together, and his wife Vasant Kanabran says that, she says that many people were very close friends to Kanna, because he was a very good lawyer, and they were very, very fond of him. But when the emergency was declared, what happened is people got scared. The fear was such that, everybody said, if we associate with this guy, with Kanabran, the state could pick us up tomorrow. So the way Vasant Kanabran described it, people would see Kanabran coming from down the corridor of the court, they'd see him and they'd turn away, or they look down, because to associate with him was seen as being dangerous. So then you get again the imperative of a totalitarian society, a totalitarian regime, is to prevent the right to association. And your imperative, on the other hand, is to encourage the right to association, because that is fulfilling the promise of the UDHR. Give you an example again in the Indian context, in the contemporary context. You look at a law such as the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. What is it fundamentally criminalizing? Fundamentally, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act is criminalizing your freedom of association, the freedom of thought, and the freedom of expression. If you look at the range of people who picked up under it, they're picked up not for committing a, within quotes, a terrorist offense. They're committed for associating with other people. They're committed for actually daring to form another society, another grouping, which thinks differently from the state. So dissent is what is criminalized through this entire form, such as the UAPA. But anyway, the UAPA as a threat to the right to association is something you have to think about. The last part of it, which I refer to, is in terms of the freedoms which make you human, is the right to assembly. Again, you have the right to association in terms of form groupings or come together with other human beings. And then how do you express your opinion in such a way that the state hears you? One way in which you express your opinion is through the right to assembly. Is by the spontaneous or planned protests or demonstrations which communicate an opinion which the state cannot ignore. And that's fundamental to a democracy. It's absolutely fundamental to democracy. And if you take one of the most remarkable examples of the right to assembly in recent times, is the year long or the farmers movement, which exercised the right to assembly for over 1 year. Can you imagine a year in which it recognized the right to assembly? And they've finally been successful in communicating their opinion or their worldview to the government. So in a sense, part of the reason why I think on today, on December 7th, or sorry, December 10th, on Human Rights Day, two important markers in terms of the freedoms we're talking about is one is the release of Sudha Bharadwaj on bail, who is one of the people who is arrested for exercising a right to speech, right to association under the UAPA. And second is the culmination or the successful culmination of the farmers' movement, which is exercising its right to assembly for over a year. In one of the most remarkable protests which we've seen as far as this country is concerned. So that gives you a sense of if you go back again, UDHR, all persons are born free and equal dignity and rights. Freedom, we talked about in some sense. How much more time do we have? Sorry, I might have got slightly carried away. Tell me how much time we have, so I'll.
No, we still have enough time, about 20 minutes, but we can take questions which can be addressed later.
Okay, fine. Okay, then I'll address the two other questions which I want to do. I think we have time, which is thank you, which is the born free and equal in dignity and rights. Freedom we've talked about in some sense. What does freedom mean? Let's look at the question of what does equality mean? again, I think Father Gerald alluded to one part of it, which is the idea of equality and the idea of economic inequality. Again, a very significant and very, very central, very, very important issue. Again, in this context, I'll invite you to read this book by Thomas Piketty called Capital and Ideology, if you get a chance. The point he's making, it's a very, very important point. The point he's making is that just in figures, in the 1980s, 10% of the world's population, 10% of the world's population had enjoyed 25 to 30% of the world's income. As is 20 years later, 2018, that is 38 years later, okay, 38 years later, 2018, 10% of the world's population enjoys 55% of the income. So you see a dramatic increase in inequality, even in the short period that we're talking about. And then look at figures, recent figures by Oxfam. They indicated, I mean, we know that lockdown was a period of difficulty and pain for a lot of people. And we know that a lot of people lost jobs. We know that a lot of employments were really destroyed. And we know that till today, many people are really, really struggling because of what the lockdown meant as far as their livelihoods are concerned, But the amazing fact that they come up with is that during the lockdown, the wealth of Indian billionaires increased by 35%. I was looking at the figures like, what? It increased by 35%? When, I mean, I understand. I mean, if it was stationary, one would understand. But actually, people have benefited in the entire period, enormous pain for a large section of the world's population. So the question of inequality is central and key. And I'll give you one more instance from the Piketty book, which I think is important to understand inequality. The Piketty does a kind of you'd call it a kind of a global analysis over a time period, and he says that the period of the greatest inequality from 1789 to 1980 was the period from 1789 to 1914. 1789, for those of you who have it on the tip of your fingers, is the French Revolution. So post the French Revolution, leading up to World War I, was the most unequal period the world had ever seen. And what did that inequality lead to? Piketty's analysis is that inequality was not sustainable. That inequality led, the tensions generated by that inequality, in particular in Germany, led to World War I and subsequently to World War II, right? And of course, post World War II, of course, his analysis, then the world went on the inequality question, the world went on a correction mechanism, right? And so we had the emergent social democracies around the world, and of course the USSR was there, and communist countries were there, and China as well. And all of this meant that right from the 1945 onwards, right up to 1980, inequalities were the lowest level the world had ever seen. But with the onset of globalization, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, again inequalities on the rise. And his analysis is today the levels of inequality the world is seeing is similar to the levels of inequality we saw in the period of 1789 to 1914. So the question then, of course, is that kind of inequality sustainable? What are kind of demons such kinds of inequality releases? And we saw the demons in the 1914 and 1930s with the rise of Hitler and authoritarians around the world. And today, in a similar way, if you look at a range of analysis, people are talking over the rise of authoritarians around the world. And so the question we need to ask is inequality the driving force for this rise of authoritarianism around the world? If that is so, and Piketty's argument is that is so, then you have to find a way of addressing the inequality. And of course, I mean, Piketty, being a good economist, has a range of solutions which he gives you on just very fantastic, I mean, minutiae of policy level solutions of what one should do, right? The including progressive tax income and increasing taxation on income and wealth, taxation on the flows of capital, and heavier investment, health education, etc. So, range of policy proposals he puts forward to what he calls towards more of a democratic socialism. But anyway, leave that point there and saying that inequality obviously has to be tackled if you're looking at the promise of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And one more point I'll make on inequality, and again, we go back to the drafting of the Indian Constitution. You have, of course, the famous speech, concluding speech by Dr. Ambedkar, where he says, I mean, when even while marking the coming into force or the adoption of the Indian Constitution as a moment of celebration, he marks a moment of self-awareness about the path down which India is going. As he says, India is entering into a life of contradictions. He says that on civil and political rights, you have equality, where you're one person, one vote. But as far as social and economic matters are concerned, you have inequality. You don't have the idea of one person, one value. Right? And he says these contradictions, which are there, can blow themselves up if you don't take remedial action. So it's in your best interest, as whoever you are in the country, to say we have to address the levels of inequality, because it will explode, and that's the lessons of global history. So that's on the question of inequality, and maybe I'll end with the last point, which Father Jerry anyway touched upon, which is the idea of free and equal in dignity and rights. What do you mean by dignity? Again, the last but very, very significant concept as far as human rights is concerned is the idea of dignity. What do we mean by dignity? Right? And dignity, in a sense, alludes to the fundamentally what it means to be human. It is in some ways the other of humiliation. It's a state where you to be in a state of indignity or to be humiliated is to be stripped in the sense of a humanity. And in a sense, what is the stripping of a person's humanity? What does that mean, right? And how does that happen? And give you just a couple of examples of where the Supreme Court has interpreted it. With respect to prisoners' rights, the conclusion the court has come to is a prisoner is still entitled to human rights, even if he or she is in prison. Just because you're in prison doesn't mean you lose all your fundamental rights. What you definitely do not lose is your right to dignity. And dignity, again, the concreteness of dignity is what is dignity in the context of a prisoner? And the court concludes that dignity in the context of a prisoner includes your right to associate with other prisoners, includes your right not to be subject to solitary confinement, includes your right to have reading material and material which nourishes the life of the spirit or life of the and as well as the right to health. Right? A range of things which become the basis of dignity are things you are entitled to as a prisoner. That's part of your right to dignity. And maybe the last point I'll make, and just leave it with that, is the idea, again, we go back to the idea of law, that the idea of dignity, which again, going back to the history of dignity, dignity finds its place in the Indian Constitution. Akash Singh Ratho's opinion is because of the contribution of Dr. Ambedkar. It's not there in the objectives of the resolution. It's there in the preamble, and it's there in the preamble because very integral from Ambedkar's point of view. And the way he put it, he says, man does not live by bread alone. So he was very clear that dignity is something which is so integral that it's something which can't be completely captured within an economic analysis of economic inequality alone. And so this dignity which emerges, if you take it from that viewpoint, the Indian Constitution dignity emerges from an understanding of caste discrimination. That's the context in which it emerges. When it goes to the Supreme Court, it's given the language or the understanding of the entire issue of prisoners' rights in the 1960s. In 2018, Supreme Court gives another interpretation. They link up dignity to the idea of intimate choices about your intimate life. So the point the Supreme Court makes is, in Navteet Singh Johar, the point that they make is your right to make decisions about who you choose to be in love with is part of a right to dignity. So very centrally, they say that the discrimination around sexual orientation and gender identity is really you're affecting the right to dignity. The point I'm making with all of this is to say that, again, look at the language of dignity and the fact that each generation imbues that concept with its own meaning. The language of freedom, each generation imbues the concept of freedom with its own meaning. And the language of equality, similarly, each generation imbues that language, that concept with its own meaning. So that is the value of the UDHR, the fact that you can find it your own meaning and take forward a struggle for that value, imbuing that concept with the new meaning based on the issues which you face in your contemporary context. I'll stop with that. Yeah, thanks.
Participants, if you have any questions, you can feel free to type it in the chat box. I can give you a minute to do the same.
You may even raise your hand and I can unmute you.
Oh, am I audible?
Yes.
Good evening, ma'am. Good evening, sir. Good evening to everyone present here. Sir, I had a doubt. Like, it's just a question. You have heard about the Beam Koregaon case where Father Stanswami died recently in the jail. He was a human rights activist, and there were several other human rights activists and lawyers who were arrested in the same case. And despite, like, there were some accusations which weren't proved. Anyways, my question is, Mr. Like Father Stanswami had asked for a medical bail, and he had raised many issues, which, if you take a reference to the human rights, had to be approved. Yet they weren't approved, or he wasn't given a bail. So, how do you see this? Like, where exactly does the human rights stand in our country? And one more question, sir. Can you please repeat the names of the books you had told and the article or the report you wanted us to read? Thank you.
I think on the books question, hopefully your colleagues can help me. Please, whatever I mentioned, whoever remembers, please put it in the chat box. That might be one way of going about it, because I don't remember what and all I mentioned now. If you give me some hint about which particular book you want me to talk about, I can talk about it. That's not a problem. But if there's in the chat box you mentioned something, I can potentially elaborate on that. And also we have seen that if anybody's got anything out of what I said, it's a useful thing to do. So yeah, on your first question, uh, see the way to look at it. I think it's an important way to look at it. Is we have to understand that human rights is a product of struggle, and human rights is also the outcome of struggle. Right? The UDHR is there. It doesn't mean that the UDHR becomes operational in our everyday lives. It's there as something which provides you the support to take forward a certain kind of a concrete struggle. Uh, so to say that, I mean, to expect, I mean, of course, in ideal situation, what happened should not have happened to anybody because that's a violation of the human rights. You're 100% right. You're 100% right. But we don't live in an ideal situation. And if you don't live in an ideal situation, you have to start seeing the fact that human rights is a way in which you can articulate some of the concerns you have and a way in which you can take forward a concrete kind of a struggle. And you're very right. I mean, in terms of, go the issues again as far as Father stands for me is concerned. Uh, many issues which come up. One, of course, is the question that why did the state even choose to arrest somebody who was 82 years old? What threat does an 82-year-old person pose? And here again, the legal question comes in because the argument you would make at the level of international law and international thinking is there's something called at the UN level, there's something called rights of older persons. And the argument you'd make with respect to older persons, again, this is the legal argument, is that we go back to the point actually. If we say prisoners, people are detained, the state has a right to deprive you of a liberty. It doesn't have a right to deprive you of a dignity. It doesn't have a right to deprive you of a life. That's not what the state is signing up for when it arrests you on any offense. Whatever the offense you may have committed or may be accused of having committed. In this particular case, when you're 82 and the state arrests you, then there are very different challenges an 82-year-old person faces. What the international law literature indicates is when you 80 to your older persons, I won't put the age, but older persons, the challenge that they face on imprisonment would be manifold. How do you adjust to a life in prison? We know, any person who's looked after older persons knows that older people are used to certain spaces, right? And you're used to a house where you know where to go, how to go from room A to room B, and the toilet you know how to use, etc. Suddenly, you put that 82-year-old person in a prison. You can imagine the conditions in prison. You can imagine the conditions of toilets. You can imagine the difficulty in navigating that space. And invariably, what happens is, and this is documented literature by the the Red Cross Committee, invariably, older persons experience a series of falls, right? The kind of medicines which they used to, which they get at home, often, and this is the case as far as Stan is concerned as well, often the prisons are not able to provide you the level of medical care. Again, going back to the point, as for older persons, what is the right that you have as far as medical care is concerned? The international literature indicates that you are entitled to specific care on grounds of being an older person. That is you're entitled to care by geriatric care, which looks at your particular conditions. Again, many complicated factors come in. You and me, if you give you a tablet for a particular problem, you could potentially solve the problem. Older persons, we give them a tablet for a particular problem, it could create a range of other problems. Which means you must have somebody who's able to monitor that level of medical care and saying, hey, what are the medicines we're giving the person? None of this was done as far as the Father Stan was concerned. So the range of complicated questions on how his rights as an older person were violated by his imprisonment. And the argument is really this. I think the imprisonment was not just a removal of his right to locomotion, but was really a violation of the right to life itself. Because in effect, you imposed a death sentence on him. Because you said that because an older person in Indian jails means the person will die. That's the reality of the matter. So it was the way we'd argue that point out. We'll say that the court should never have conceded the fact that he should be imprisoned. It's a complete failure, the way I see it, of the way the Indian judicial system operated vis-a-vis Father Stan. Yeah.
So the next question is from my fellow MC. Good afternoon, respected sir. My question for you today is, in spirit and in letter, the laws in the UNDHER are truly beautiful. However, sir, as we all know, the implementation and application of the same do not live up to the standards set to us by the drafters of the respective laws. Example, UN's role in the genocide of Srebrenica, custodial deaths in India, etc. My question to you, sir, is how do you think we, the lawyers of tomorrow, better the implementation of these laws in not only our country, but society at large?
One way people think, this is why I want to get at this point. One way that people think of the UDHR is these beautiful words fell out of the heavens. They didn't. They were a result of very, very concrete struggle. I'll give you one story, one very, very important story, which I think is worth recognizing. Again, this is a book. Please note this down if you get a chance to read it. It's a book by Philippe Sands, who's an international criminal lawyer called East West Street. And Philippe Sands' argument is two concepts: the concept of genocide and the concept of crimes against humanity were attributable to two people who lived on this one street in Eastern European town called Lviv. That is, Hersch Lauterpacht is responsible for the concept of crimes against humanity, and Raphael Lemkin is responsible for the concept of genocide. And I'll just give you a quick description of Lemkin's life and why were these two concepts, which are central to international law, evolved on one street in an obscure East European town. The point he's making is both Lauterpacht and Lemkin lost their families, entire families, in the Nazi Holocaust. And they were driven men. They said, we have to do something about this. And Lemkin, for example, his point was this, right? He invented the term genocide, genos meaning people and side meaning kill. And he not just invented the term called genocide, he lobbied to have the convention on the prevention of genocide and punishment, suppression of genocide enacted. And in a time before lobbying was born, here was this man haunting the corridors of the UN with the moral force of his being, saying that, I've suffered this kind of injury. This can't happen to anybody else. We must enact a convention on genocide, right? And his lobbying effort pays off and the convention against genocide gets enacted. And as he puts it, this was the epitaph on my mother's grave, the convention against genocide. I'm giving you this bit of background to indicate that, none of this came easy. All of this was the result of struggle. So if today you're asking, what can we do? The only thing you can do is be part of struggle. The only thing you can do is say, we are going to be a part of this change. We're going to be a part of this transformation of this change, which will happen, right? And we're going to be part of either setting in place legal concepts, implementing legal concepts, setting in place structures, fighting trials in courts, doing human rights lawyering work, range of things which need to be done. So I think you're in the right place in the Joseph's Law School to be asking this question. And I think there's a lot to be done as far as the future is concerned. And you take inspiration from people in the past and say that go back again to my fundamental point. You have to go back to the right to association. Sometimes these things become thinkable when you're with other people. Sometimes things become doable when you're with other people. And sometimes you need just a grouping or a community to be able to take forward a certain imagination or a vision to implement the promise of the UDHR.
Hi, sir. I was the one who asked the question. Thank you so much for that insightful response. So there is one more question in the chat box. This is on the question says, why do some groups require special human rights? Does this mean that they have more rights than others?
That question comes up again and again. And the argument is there's no such thing as special human rights, right? And the argument is there's something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which applies to all human beings. And what do you mean by special human rights actually comes in this particular context, right? When you're saying the world is a fundamentally unequal place, when you're saying some people have had far less resources and background than other people have had, then there's a famous statement which Justice Krishna is fond of quoting, again, N.M. Thomas. He quotes André Gide, who says that the law in its majesty prohibits for the rich man and the poor man from sleeping under the bridge and begging under the street. Right? So you see that on the face of it, the law is not discriminating. It's telling you that, the same law for everybody. But does it differentially impact one group or another group? From the St. Joseph's College of Law, you guys are not going to be begging on the streets, right? There will be people who will be begging on the streets. But if the law prohibits begging on the streets, does it impact one grouping more than another grouping, right? So there's a way in which the law differentially impacts different groupings. That's one part of the answer. Second part of the answer is, if you see a differential, if people are graded and hierarchical in the way in their lives, should the law respond to that differential condition or not? That's the question you have to face, right? And so, if you look at the Indian Constitution, look at, for example, the special provisions as far as women are concerned, the idea of affirmative action as far as Dalits, what the constitutional language scheduled castes are concerned, or scheduled tribes are concerned, that comes from an understanding of what they call compensatory discrimination. Again, the book here to read on this is Mark Galanter, Competing Equalities. And the point Mark Galanter is making is it's called competing equality. Yes, the point Mark Galanter is making is it's a compensatory regime of equality. What one is saying is, for centuries of discrimination suffered by a particular grouping, Indian society today decides that we're going to compensate for the discrimination over centuries and allow you to participate on a more equal footing. That's the argument of what, again, the distinction is between what is called affirmative action and reservation, right? you can make this distinction as well. Reservation could be that, I reserve certain seats for a certain grouping in a certain college. That's one way of going about it. Affirmative action is a broader concept. You're saying that, that it's not necessary that I just reserve seats. It could be that I provide facilities to people so they can compete more equally. It could be that, I provide scholarships. It could be that I provide educational facilities, I provide free textbooks, etc. All of which allows you to compete on a more equal footing with other groupings. So the special provision point, as you look at it from this point of view, if you live in a society which is fundamentally unequal, and if the treating of everybody equal in an equal society perpetuates that inequality, should you do something about addressing the inequality or not? That's the question. And the constitutional framework believes we should. And that's the regime that the Constitution sets in place.
So there looks like there's one last question. Today, when we all uphold the idea in our minds that we are all equal, yet there are many things happening in the society we live in. For example, as in Bangalore, the state government is trying to introduce anti-conversion bill, which is obviously making a group of people feel insecure. Don't you think that this is the kind of decision which would mislead the secularism idea of our country?
This is why I think it's a good question. This is why I think it's very, very useful to go back to the Constitution. Again, you're a law student, right? What I think you should do, what I think you should definitely do, is go back to the provision in the Indian Constitution which talks about the right to profess, practice, and propagate religion, which is Article 25 of the Constitution. As law students, look at Article 25, look at the Constituent Assembly debates. What is the discussion which happened at that moment in time in terms of what is this meaning, what is the meaning of this provision? Okay? And that gives you a base to make an argument against, for example, contemporary legal frameworks. Again, you look at it this way, right? I mean, do we take every law which is put forward as saying that yes, the law put by the government be accepted, etc., etc., or do we say that? I mean, what is the imperative? In constitutional democracy, the imperative is very clear. You will look at every law from the perspective of the Constitution guarantees and what the Constitution says. If the Constitution guarantees every citizen the right to profess, practice, and propagate religion of their choice and the right to freedom of conscience, then the question to ask is, does this anti-conversion law violate the promise of the Constitution in Article 25? And again, you go back to the drafting of the Constitution, look at the range of speeches made at that moment in the CAD. It's very, very interesting. I mean, since you're in St. Joseph's College of Law, it might make sense mentioning this. There's a speech by T.T. Krishnamachari, and he says that he begins in a personal note. He's supporting the Article 25 as it stands, and he says, in a personal note, I will say that I've studied in Christian institutions my whole life. I know the good work which is happening through these institutions, and I know that conversion has not been the objective as far as this grouping is concerned. And he goes on to say that the idea of practice, profess, and propagate is an integral part of a constitutional framework. You can't now control that by saying that conversion. And the other very, very important point he makes, he says that as the Hindu community, let's also look inward. Why are people converting? Is it the external pressures or there's the internal turning going on? Are people saying that we've been treated very badly by our fellow Hindus? We don't want to be part of this framework. We want to leave. Is that also part of it? Again, you go back to Ambedkar and conversion. The important point is on the date of conversion. What are the number of people who convert with Ambedkar to Buddhism? It's 5 million people, right? It's not a small number. Oh, sorry. It's 5 lakh people. It's not a small number. So again, you get a sense of a churning which is there in the Indian society. Again, the way to answer it is maybe this way: is that there's a media response. There's one part of it. But as law students, again, what is the imperative? You understand what does the law mean from the perspective of the people who want to get converted, the people who want to do conversion. What does it mean from range of these contexts, right? Go back and understand why do people want to get converted. I think that's an important point to understand as well. Do people feel a sense of dissatisfaction in the religious framework in which they are? That's one point. That's a structural point. But the other point is equally simple, which is that end of the day, It's a part of your autonomy, part of your right to choice. People make all kinds of choices. And if you choose to say, I don't want to be part of religion A, you want to be part of religion B, that's your constitutional right. It's recognized. Nobody can tell you not to convert from group A to group B or religion A to religion B. That's part of your, that's the Supreme Court has recognized. Again, if you go back to the privacy judgment, Supreme Court recognized what is the right to privacy? Your right to privacy includes your right to make decisions about your life, including your right to faith, your right to dress, your right to make decisions about your right to food. All of this comes within your right to privacy. So it's a part of your again your freedom. You're part of your right to choose your religion is a part of your human right to freedom. So it should be, I think, should be protected from that sense. But again, I think this is, you shouldn't look at this as a talk. Huh? Look at this as an invitation to read more widely on the CAD debate, read more widely the Supreme Court judgments, and look at it from the perspective of both the the person who's converting and the person who's getting converted. What are the impact on a range of these groupings?
That was a very interesting and insightful session, sir. It's my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion. I, on behalf of the management of St. Joseph's College of Law and the entire team of Nivaran, would like to thank our esteemed speaker, Mr. Aravind Narayan, for taking time out of his busy schedule to be with us here today for the valedictory session of the Human Rights Week celebrations 2021. We would also like to express our gratitude to Sir for helping us enhance our understanding pertaining to the significance of this day. Your presence and wise words help magnify our cause in the best way possible, sir. Thank you. I would now like to call upon our faculty coordinator, Ms. Aishwarya Chandra, to address the gathering.
Good evening, everybody. To keep it quick and also to ensure that there is enough time for the documentary screenings which are due and which is most awaited, I am going to be declaring results. But before that, thank you so much, Arvind sir, for talking to us about the constitutional values and rejuvenating the spirit in us about of the Constitution itself. Thank you so much for addressing all of us. Thank you, sir. So I'm going to try and share screen. So the winners of the Human Rights Week 2021, the first event that we had on day one was the poetry competition and the essay writing competition. The winners of the poetry competition is Miriam Jacob, first BCom LLB, and the second place goes to Purnima Kada of fourth BA LLB. The next event is the essay writing competition, and the first place goes to Roshan Jacob of the second LLB, and the second place goes to Hari Krishnan of first BA LLB A. On day 3, we had the painting competition. And on this day, the first place goes to Dawn Davis of first LLB, and the second place goes to Malika Nath. Very quickly, the poetry competition was judged by Mr. Abhimanyu Kumar, and the essay writing competition was judged by Ms. Tejaswini Yu. And the painting competition was judged by Professor Thomas Alexander. On the same day, we had the collage making competition, and the first place goes to Shashi Shamir Danwar of first VA LLB, and the second place goes to Anushri NP of third BBA LLB. And finally, the most awaited event is of the inter-college competition or the documentary making competition. The third place goes to Loyola College, a team comprising of Nishant Agarwal, Ruksar Banu, Priyank DN, and Hemant G. The second place also goes to Loyola College again. Binoy DeCosta, Sana Fatima, Kusuma Rao, and Rahul Chetri. Sorry. Yes. The second place goes to Loyola College, Binoy DeCosta, Sana Fatima, Kusuma Rao, and Rahul Chetri. And the first place is for St. Joseph's College of Law, Malavika B and team. Congratulations, all the winners. I just want to let you know that if some of your names or teams have not come up on these slides, on behalf of the Human Rights Cell, I assure you that you have performed very well and come up with really good content and many masterpieces in the poetry and painting competitions as well. I assure you that they will reach the limelight at some point later, and we will take responsibility for ensuring that. So don't be worried if your names didn't come up in any of these slides, right? Without taking much time, I am going to play the winning documentary for this competition, which is Insaaniyat Inter-College Documentary Making Competition for the Human Rights Week of 2021. Is the screen visible to everybody? Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
I think it's 1 second.
Lot of problems we have faced. ಕೋವಿಡ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ತುಂಬಾ ತೊಂದರೆ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ತೊಂದರೆ.
ನಮಗೆ ಒಂದು ಕೆಲಸ ಕೊಡಿ, ಒಂದು ಮನೆ ಕೊಡಿ, ತಿಂಗಳಿಗೆ 5,000 ಪೆನ್ಷನ್ ಕೊಡಿ.
ಕೋವಿಡ್ ಆಗಿದ್ರಿಂದ ನಮಗೆ ಕಲೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಕಡಿಮೆನೇ, ಏನಿದ್ರೆ ಜನಗಳ ಹತ್ರ ದುಡ್ಡಿಲ್ಲ.
Bangalore is a beautiful city with the right balance of tradition and modern culture. Everyone must give the city a visit at least once in their life and see for themselves the excellence of the city bustling with youth and vigor. See for yourself all the smiling faces. 1.5 years back, something unfortunate happened to the humanity and the world. Yes, you know what I'm talking about. The outbreak of coronavirus. Many of us fell sick, lost the lives of our near and dear ones. But COVID was not the only issue. We all were struggling physically, emotionally, and financially. Have you ever thought about the lives of the people who were treated less than humans? Let's talk about the lives of transgenders throughout the pandemic times.
ಹಮಾಮದಲ್ಲಿ ಸೆಕ್ಸ್ ವರ್ಕರ್ ಎಲ್ಲ ಬರ್ತಾರೆ. ನೀವು ಇದು ಯಾವಾಗಿಂದ ಸ್ಟಾರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರಿ?
ಸೆಕ್ಸ್ ವರ್ಕ್ ಸ್ಟಾರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಹಮಾಮದಲ್ಲಿ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡಿ?
ಇವಾಗ ಒಂದು 2 ವರ್ಷ ಆಯಿತು ಸೆಕ್ಸ್ ವರ್ಕ್ ಸ್ಟಾರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ. ಒಂದೊಂದು ದಿವಸ ಬಂದುಬಿಟ್ಟು 4-5 ಜನ ಬರ್ತಾರೆ, ಒಂದೊಂದು ದಿವಸ ಏನೂ ಇರಲ್ಲ, ತುಂಬ ಕಷ್ಟನೇ. ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಹಮಾಮ್ ಜೀವನನೂ ನಡೆಸೋದು ತುಂಬ ಕಷ್ಟ ಇದೆ. ಯಾವಾಗಲೂ ನಾವು ನೆನೆಸ್ಕೊಂಡಂಗೆ ಅದು ಹಮಾಮಲ್ಲಿ ಇರಲ್ಲ. ಒಂದು ದಿವಸ ಬಂದುಬಿಟ್ಟು 2-3 ಜನ ಬರ್ತಾರೆ, ಒಂದೊಂದು ದಿವಸ 10 ಜನನೂ ಬರ್ತಾರೆ. ಒಬ್ಬೊಬ್ಬರು ನಮ್ಗೆ ಇಷ್ಟ ಆಗಿರೋರು ಬರ್ತಾರೆ, ಒಬ್ಬೊಬ್ಬರು ನಮ್ಗೆ ಇಷ್ಟ ಆಗಿರೋರು ಬರ್ತಾರೆ. ಬಟ್ ನಾವು ಅದು ಕಷ್ಟವಾಗೇ ನಾವು ಮಾಡಬೇಕು ಆ ಕೆಲಸವನ್ನು.
ಆ್ಯಕ್ಚುಲಿ ನಾನು ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಬಂದುಬಿಟ್ಟು ನಾನೊಂದು ಟ್ರಾನ್ಸ್ ವುಮನ್ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ಕೊಳಕ್ಕೆ ಇಷ್ಟಪಡ್ತೀನಿ. ನಮಗೆ ಜೀವನ ತುಂಬ ಕಷ್ಟ ಇದೆ. ನಾವು ರೆಂಟ್ ಹೌಸಲ್ಲಿರೋದು. ನಾವು ಬಂದುಬಿಟ್ಟು ಈ ಪಬ್ಲಿಕ್ ಟೋಲ್ಗಳಲ್ಲೆಲ್ಲ ಬಸ್ತಿ ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಸೆಕ್ಸ್ ವರ್ಕ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ, ಬೆಗ್ಗಿಂಗ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ ಪಬ್ಲಿಕ್ ಪ್ಲೇಸಲ್ಲಿ. ಇದೇ ನಮ್ಮ ಜೀವನ ವೃತ್ತಿ.
ನಾವು ಕಲೆಕ್ಷನ್ಗೆ ಹೋಗ್ತೀವಿ, ಅಂಗಡಿ ಕಲೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ. ಮತ್ತು ನಾವು ಸೆಕ್ಸ್ ವರ್ಕ್ ಮಾಡಲ್ಲ.
ನಾನು ಡಿಫ್ರೆಂಟು. ಅಂದರೆ ನಾನು ನನ್ನ ಜೀವನ ನಡೆಸೋಕ್ಕೆ ನನ್ನ ಅಲ್ಲೇ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡುವಂಥದ್ದು. ಮತ್ತು ಬೆಗ್ಗಿಂಗು ಮಾಡೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಸೆಕ್ಸ್ ವರ್ಕು ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ದಿನ ಮಾಡಿದೆ, ಈಗ ನಾನು ಸೆಕ್ಸ್ ವರ್ಕ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾಯಿಲ್ಲ.
ಕೋವಿಡ್ ಮುಂಚೆ ಆದರೆ ಕಲೆಕ್ಷನ್ಗಳು ಒಂದು ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಪರವಾಗಿಲ್ಲ ನಮಗೆ. ಕೋವಿಡ್ ಆಗಿದ್ದರಿಂದ ನಮಗೆ ಕಲೆಕ್ಷನ್ನು ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಕಡಿಮೆನೇ. ಏನಿದ್ರೆ ಜನಗಳ ಹತ್ರ ದುಡ್ಡಿಲ್ಲ, ಅವ್ರ ಹತ್ರನೇ ದುಡ್ಡು ಇಲ್ದಿರೋರು ನಮ್ಗೆ ಹಿಂಗೆ ಕೊಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಅವ್ರ ಜನಗಳ ಹತ್ರ ದುಡ್ಡು ಇಲ್ದಿರೆ ಅಂಗಡಿಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ವ್ಯಾಪಾರ ಆಗಲ್ಲ. ಅಂಗಡಿಗಳಿಗೆ ನಾವು ಕಲೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಇದ್ರೆ ಅವರು ಕೊಡಲ್ಲ. ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ತುಂಬ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಕೋವಿಡ್ ಮುಂಚೆ ನಮಗೆ ಕಲೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಇದ್ದ ಥರ ಕೋವಿಡ್ ಆದಮೇಲೆ ಯಾವುದೂ ಇಲ್ಲ ಕಲೆಕ್ಷನ್.
ಸೆಕ್ಸ್ ವರ್ಕು ಅವಾಗ ನಡೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಎಲ್ಲ ಕಡೆ ಲಾಕ್ಡೌನ್ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಬೆಗ್ಗಿಂಗು ಮಾಡೋಂಗಿಲ್ಲ, ಯಾಕಂದರೆ ಎಲ್ಲ ಶಾಪ್ಸ್ ಎಲ್ಲ ಕ್ಲೋಸ್ ಇದೆ. ಅಂಥ ಟೈಮಲ್ಲಿ ತುಂಬ ಊಟಕ್ಕೂ ತುಂಬ ಕಷ್ಟಪಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಕೆಲವಾರು NGOಗಳವರು, ಕೆಲವಾರು ಸಂಘ ಸಂಸ್ಥೆಗಳವರು ನಮಗೆ ದುಡ್ಡು ಕೊಡೋದಿರ್ಬೋದು, ರೇಷನ್ ಕೊಡೋದಿರ್ಬೋದು, ಈ ಥರ ಎಲ್ಲನೂ ಸಪೋರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅದರಿಂದ ಸುಮಾರು ಜನ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಚೇತರಿಸ್ಕೊಂಡ್ರು. ಆದರೂ ಅದರ ಒಂದು ಎಫೆಕ್ಟು ಇವತ್ತಿಗೂ ಇದೆ.
ನಮ್ಮ ಫ್ರೆಂಡ್ಸ್ಗೆ 2 ಕೋವಿಡ್ ಬಂದಿತ್ತು. ಆ ಟೈಮಲ್ಲಿ ಅವ್ರು ಬಂದುಬಿಟ್ಟು ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಆಚೆ ಬರೋಕ್ಕಾಗಿಲ್ಲ. ಅದರಿಂದ ಈ ಸಮರ ಸೊಸೈಟಿ ಯಶವಂತಪುರ ಬಂದುಬಿಟ್ಟು ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ನಮ್ಮ ಕಡೆಯಿಂದ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ರೇಷನ್ ನಾವು ಹಂಚಿದ್ದೀವಿ.
ಕೋವಿಡ್ ಮುಂಚೆ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಜೀವನ ನಡೀತಾ ಇತ್ತು. ಟೋಲ್ಗೆ ಹೋಗೋದಾಗ್ಬೋದು, ಬಸ್ತಿ ಮಾಡೋದಾಗಲಿ, ಬೆಗ್ಗಿಂಗ್ ಮಾಡೋದಾಗಲಿ, ಹೇಗೋ ಒಂದು ಜೀವನ ಒಂದು ಸಿಸ್ಟಮ್ಯಾಟಿಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ಹೋಗ್ತಾ ಇತ್ತು. ಬಟ್ ಈ ಕೋವಿಡ್ ಬಂದ ಮೇಲೆ ತುಂಬ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ಸ್ನ ಫೇಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ. ತುಂಬ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ಸ್ ಕೂಡ ಇವತ್ತಿಗೂ ಇದೆ, ಬಟ್ ಅದಿನ್ನೂ ಕಮ್ಮಿ ಆಗಿಲ್ಲ. ಮುಂಚೆಗೂ ಇವಾಗ ಲಾಟ್ ಆಫ್ ಡಿಫ್ರೆನ್ಸ್ ಇದೆ.
ನಿಮ್ಮ ಲ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ಲಾರ್ಡ್ ಮನೆ ಓನರು ಏನಾದರೂ ನಿಮಗೆ ಈ ಲಾಕ್ಡೌನಲ್ಲಿ ಏನಾದರೂ ಟಾರ್ಚರ್ ಕೊಟ್ಟರಾ? ಮನೆ ಖಾಲಿ?
ಹೌದು, ಕರೆಕ್ಟ್, ಒಳ್ಳೆ ಕ್ವಶನ್. ಹೌದು, ನನ್ನ ಮನೆ ಓನರ್ ನನಗೆ ನಾನು 3 ಮಂತ್ಸು ರೆಂಟ್ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿರಲಿಲ್ಲ. ತುಂಬಾ ಟಾರ್ಚರ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು. ಎಲ್ರಿಗೂ ಸಂಬಳ ಬರ್ತಾಯಿದೆ, ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ಯಾಕೆ ಬರಲ್ಲ, ನಿಮ್ದು ಯಾವ ಆಫೀಸು, ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ಲಾಕ್ಡೌನ್ ಆದರೆ ಹಂಗಾದ್ರೆ ನಾವೇನು ಮಾಡಬೇಕು, ಮನೆ ಖಾಲಿ ಮಾಡಿರಿ ಅಂತೇಳಿ ತುಂಬ ಟಾರ್ಚರ್ ಕೊಟ್ಟರು. ಆವಾಗ ನಾನು ನನ್ನ ಸಮುದಾಯದವ್ರನ್ನ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿ ಗೊತ್ತಿರೋರನ್ನ 1-2 ಕರ್ಕೊಂಡೋಗಿ ಅವ್ರ ಹತ್ರ ಮಾತಾಡ್ಸಿಸಿ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ சமாதானம் ಮಾಡಿ.
ஓனர் சப்போர்ட் பண்ணாங்க எங்களுக்கு. ஓனர் இல்லை, எங்கள் ஓனர் அது மாதிரி எதுவும் சொல்லலை. இது மாதிரி அவங்களுக்கும் கொஞ்சம் ப்ராப்ளம் தான் இருக்குது. ஆனால் நான் இருந்துன்னு சொன்னேன், எனக்கு ஒரு 2-3 மாதம் டைம் கொடுங்கோ, நான் கொடுக்குறேன். நீங்கள் இது மாதிரி சொன்னால் நாங்கள் எங்கே போகிறது, 2-3 மாதம் டைம் கொடுங்கோ அன்ட்டு ஒரு 4-5 மாதத்தில் வந்துட்டு கொஞ்சம் கொஞ்சமாக வாடகை ಕ್ಲಿಯರ್ பண்ணியிருக்கிறோம். ಫ್ರೆಂಡ್ಸು ತುಂಬ 4-5 ಜನ ತುಂಬ ತೊಂದರೆ ಪಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಒಂದೇ ದಿವಸದಲ್ಲಿ ನಮ್ಮ ಫ್ರೆಂಡದ್ದು ಬಂದುಬಿಟ್ಟು ಸಾಮಾನೆಲ್ಲ ಎತ್ತಿ ಆಚೆನೇ ಹಾಕ್ಬಿಟ್ರು, ಮನೆ ನೀವು ಖಾಲಿ ಮಾಡಲೇಬೇಕು ಅಂತ. ಅವ್ರು ತುಂಬ ತೊಂದರೆ ಪಟ್ಟರು.
ಲಾಕ್ಡೌನ್ ಅಂತ ಆದಮೇಲೆ ಇಡೀ ಸೊಸೈಟಿ ಐ ಮೀನ್ ಆಲ್ ಓವರ್ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕನೇ ಲಾಕ್ಡೌನ್ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಆದರೂ ಅವರು ಓನರ್ಗಳು ಬಂದುಬಿಟ್ಟು ನೀವು ಬಾಡಿಗೆ ಕೊಡಲೇಬೇಕು, ಲೈಟ್ ಬಿಲ್ ಕಟ್ಟಲೇಬೇಕು, ನೀರು ಬಿಲ್ ಕಟ್ಟಲೇಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ನಮಗೆ ತುಂಬ ಪ್ರೆಷರ್ ಹಾಕಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ನಾವು ಆ ಟೈಮಲ್ಲಿ ತುಂಬ ತೊಂದರೆ ಇದೆ, ನಮ್ಗೆ ಆಗೋದಿಲ್ಲ ಕಟ್ಟೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಅಂತೆಲ್ಲ ಎಷ್ಟು ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು ಅವ್ರು ಕೇಳಿಲ್ಲ. ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಇದನ್ನು ಫುಲ್ಫಿಲ್ ಮಾಡಲೇಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ನಮಗೆ ತುಂಬ ಪ್ರೆಷರ್ ಹಾಕಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅಂಥ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ತುಂಬ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ಸ್ನ ನಾವು ಫೇಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ.
ಲಾಕ್ಡೌನ್ ಇರಲಿ, ಲಾಕ್ಡೌನ್ ಮುಂಚೆ ಇರಲಿ, ನಿಮಗೆ ಎಂತೆಲ್ಲ ಮೆಡಿಕಲ್ ಫೆಸಿಲಿಟೀಸ್ ಸಿಗ್ತದೆ?
ಮೆಡಿಕಲ್ ಫೆಸಿಲಿಟೀಸ್ ಅಂತ ತೊಗೊಂಡಾಗ ತುಂಬ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆ ಆಯಿತು. ಯಾಕಂದರೆ ನಮ್ಮ ಸಮುದಾಯದಲ್ಲಿ HIV ಪೇಷಂಟ್ ತುಂಬ ಜನ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಮಂತ್ಲಿ ಟ್ಯಾಬ್ಲೆಟ್ ತೊಗೊಳಕ್ಕೆ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಬಸ್ಸಸ್ ಇಲ್ಲ, ಆಟೋ ಇಲ್ಲ, ಯಾವುದೇ ಫೆಸಿಲಿಟೀಸ್ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಹೊರಗಡೆ ಹೋದರೆ ಪೊಲೀಸ್ ಹೊಡಿತಾಯಿದ್ರು. ಮತ್ತು ಬೆಂಗಳೂರಲ್ಲಿ ನಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಹೋಗೋಕ್ಕೂ ಆಗಲ್ಲ, 7-8 ಕಿಲೋಮೀಟ್ರ್ ಹಾಸ್ಪಿಟ್ಲ್ಗಳಿದೆ. ಅಂಥ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ತುಂಬ ಜನಕ್ಕೆ ಟ್ಯಾಬ್ಲೆಟ್ಗಳು ತೊಗೊಳಕ್ಕೆ ತುಂಬ ಕಷ್ಟ ಆಯಿತು. ಕೆಲವ್ರಿಗೆಲ್ಲ ನಾವೇನೇ ಟೂ ವೀಲರಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಗಿ ಅವ್ರ ಬುಕ್ಕುಗಳೆಲ್ಲ ART ಬುಕ್ ಎಲ್ಲ ಇಸ್ಕೊಂಡು ನಾವು ಹೋಗಿ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳು ಹೇಳಿ ಟ್ಯಾಬ್ಲೆಟ್ ಎಲ್ಲ ತೊಗೊಂಡು ಬಂದು ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ಆ ಥರ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳನ್ನ ತುಂಬ ಜನ ಎದುರಿಸಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಕೆಲವರೆಲ್ಲ ಟ್ಯಾಬ್ಲೆಟ್ ತೊಗೊಂಡಿಲ್ಲ.
ಈ ಲಾಕ್ಡೌನಲ್ಲಿ ನಮಗೆ ಏನು ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ, ಸಿಕ್ಕಾಗಿದ್ದೀವಿ, ಹೆಲ್ತ್ ಇಶ್ಯೂಸ್ ತುಂಬ ಆಗಿದೆ, ಆಮೇಲೆ ಜ್ವರ ಬಂದಿದೆ. ಅಂಥ ಟೈಮಲ್ಲಿ ನಮಗೆ ಯಾರೂ ಸಪೋರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿಲ್ಲ. ಫ್ಯಾಮಿಲಿಲಿ ತುಂಬ ಕಷ್ಟ, ಅಥವಾ ಫಿನಾನ್ಷಿಯಲ್ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ಸ್, ಹಾಸ್ಪಿಟ್ಲಿಗೆ ಹೋಗೋದಕ್ಕೂ ನಮಗೆ ಕಷ್ಟ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಆ ಟೈಮಲ್ಲಿ ಡೋಲೋ 650 ಅದೊಂದು ತೊಗೊಂಡು ಅದರಿಂದನೇ ನಾವು ಕ್ಯೂರ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ಬಟ್ ಹಾಸ್ಪಿಟ್ಲಿಗೆಲ್ಲ ಹೋಗೋಷ್ಟು ನಮಗೆ ಸಪೋರ್ಟ್ ಇಲ್ಲ, ಪ್ಲಸ್ ಫಿನಾನ್ಷಿಯಲಿ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ ಕೂಡ ಇತ್ತು.
ಮೆಡಿಕಲ್ ಫೆಸಿಲಿಟೀಸ್ ಎಲ್ಲ ಏನು ಸಿಗಲ್ಲ. ನಾವು ಹೋಗಿ ಮೆಡಿಕಲಲ್ಲಿ ಇದು ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಬೇಕಷ್ಟೆ.
ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ ಇತ್ತು, ಬಟ್ ಆದರೂ ವಿಧಿ ಇಲ್ಲ, ಹೋಗಲೇಬೇಕಿತ್ತು. ಹೋದಾಗ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಡಿಸ್ಕ್ರಿಮಿನೇಷನ್ ಆಗಿದೆ. ಸರಿಯಾಗಿ ಡಾಕ್ಟರ್ಗಳು ರೆಸ್ಪಾನ್ಸ್ ಮಾಡಿಲ್ಲ. ದೂರ ನಮ್ಮನ್ನ ಕೂರಿಸ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ದೇ ವೋಂಟ್ ಟಚ್ ಅಸ್. ದೇ ಯೂಸ್ ಟು ಸಿಟ್ ಫಾರ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ದೇ ಯೂಸ್ ಟು ಸಿ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ದೇ ಯೂಸ್ ಟು ರೈಟ್ ಮೆಡಿಸನ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಸೆಂಡ್ ದಟ್ಸ್ ಇಟ್. ಪ್ರಾಪರಾಗಿ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಯಾವುದೇ ರೀತಿಯಾದಂತಹ ಮೆಡಿಕೇಷನ್ ಸಿಕ್ಕಿಲ್ಲ. ಅಲ್ಲೂ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ತಾರತಮ್ಯಗಳೆಲ್ಲ ಆಗಿದೆ ನಮಗೆ.
ವ್ಯಾಕ್ಸಿನೇಷನ್ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ನಮಗೆ ಸ್ವಸ್ತಿಯವರು ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಟೈಮು ವ್ಯಾಕ್ಸಿನೇಷನ್ನ ಪ್ರೊವೈಡ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು. ಆವಾಗ ಪ್ರೊವೈಡ್ ಮಾಡಿದಾಗ ಅದು ಲಾಂಚ್ ಮಾಡುವಾಗ ಇದೇ ಥರ ಒಂದು ಮೀಡಿಯಾದವರು ಬಂದಿದ್ರು. ಆ ಮೀಡಿಯಾದಲ್ಲಿ ನಮಗೆಲ್ಲ ಮಾತಾಡ್ಸಿಸಿದ್ರು HIV ಬಗ್ಗೆ, ನೀವು ಇದು ವ್ಯಾಕ್ಸಿನೇಷನ್ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ನಿಮ್ಮವರು ಯಾಕೆ ವ್ಯಾಕ್ಸಿನೇಷನ್ ತಗೊಳ್ಳೋಕ್ಕೆ ಮುಂದೆ ಬರ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ. ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ತುಂಬ ರೀಸನ್ಸ್ ಇದೆ. ಏನಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ, ಇವ್ರಿಗೆ ಸರಿಯಾಗಿ ಅದ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಹೇಳುವಂಥವ್ರು ಇರಲಿಲ್ಲ, ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಒನ್. ಸೆಕೆಂಡ್ ಒನ್ ಏನಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ, ನಮ್ಮವ್ರಿಗೆ ಅದ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತೇ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಯಾಕಂದರೆ ಬೇರೆಯವರೆಲ್ಲ ಎದುರಿಸ್ಬಿಟ್ಟಿದ್ರು, ಅಯ್ಯೋ ವ್ಯಾಕ್ಸಿನೇಷನ್ ತೊಗೊಂಡ್ರೆ ಅದೇನೋ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ ಆಗುತ್ತಂತೆ, ಕೈ ಇದಾಗುತ್ತಂತೆ, ಕಾಲು ಇದಾಗುತ್ತಂತೆ, ಮತ್ತು ಏನು ಸ್ಟ್ರೋಕ್ ಥರ ಆಗುತ್ತಂತೆ ಅಂತ ಈ ಥರ ಎಲ್ಲ ಎದುರಿಸಿದ್ರು. ಮುಖ್ಯವಾಗಿ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಏನಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ, ನಮ್ಮಲ್ಲಿ ಎಲ್ಲ ARTಲಿ ತುಂಬ ಜನ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಕನ್ಫ್ಯೂಷನು, ART ತೊಗೊಂಡವರು ವ್ಯಾಕ್ಸಿನೇಷನ್ ತೊಗೊಂಡ್ರೆ ರಿಯಾಕ್ಷನ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ ಅನ್ನೋ ವಿಚಾರನ ಎಲ್ಲ ಕಡೆ ಹಬ್ಬಿಸ್ಬಿಟ್ಟಿದ್ರು. ಅವ್ರೇನಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ, ಅವರು ಹೋಗ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಡಾಕ್ಟ್ರ್ ಹತ್ರ ಮಾತಾಡೋಕ್ಕೂ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಮತ್ತು ಈ ವ್ಯಾಕ್ಸಿನೇಷನ್ ಕೊಡೋರು ಕ್ವಶನ್ ಕೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ, ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಹೇಳೋಕ್ಕಾಗ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ, ಇಲ್ಲ ನಾವು ಈ ಥರ ARTಲಿದ್ದೀವಿ, ಇದು ತೊಗೊಂಡ್ರೆ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ ಅಂತ. ನಾನು ಹೇಳಿದೆ, ART ಇರೋರಿಗೆ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಶುಗರ್ ಇದ್ದರೆ ತಗೋಬಾರ್ದು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ಒಂದು ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮಿಂದ ನಮ್ಮವರು ಯಾರೂ ಮುಂದೆ ಬರ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ ತಗೊಳ್ಳೋಕ್ಕೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ವಿ. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಅವರು ಅಲ್ಲೇ ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ಅವೇರ್ನೆಸ್ ಮಾಡಿ, ನೀವು ಕೂಡ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಜೊತೆಲಿರುವಂಥವ್ರಿಗೆಲ್ಲ ಹೇಳಿ ಎಲ್ರಿಗೂ ವ್ಯಾಕ್ಸಿನೇಷನ್ ಕೊಡಿಸಿ, ಇದರಿಂದ ಏನೂ ಆಗಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದಾಗ ನಾವು ನ್ಯಾಕೋದಿಂದ ಒಂದು ಇದನ್ನು ಮಾಡಿದ್ವಿ, ರೂಲ್ಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ವಿ. HIV ಪೇಷಂಟ್ ಕೂಡ ವ್ಯಾಕ್ಸಿನೇಷನ್ ಮಸ್ಟ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಶುಡ್ ತಗೊಳ್ಳೇಬೇಕು. ಯಾಕಂದರೆ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಇದು ರೋಗ ನಿರೋಧಕ ಶಕ್ತಿ ಕಡಿಮೆ ಇರುತ್ತೆ, ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಬೇಗ ಅಟ್ಯಾಕ್ ಆಗುವಂಥ ಚಾನ್ಸಸ್ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ನೀವು ತಗೊಳ್ಳೇಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದಾಗ ತುಂಬ ಜನ ಬಂದು ಎಲ್ಲ ವ್ಯಾಕ್ಸಿನೇಷನ್ ತೊಗೊಂಡ್ರು. ಸುಮಾರು ಜನದ್ದು 2 ಡೋಸು ಆಗಿದೆ.
ನಮಗೆ ಗೌರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಹೆಲ್ಪ್ ಮಾಡಿಲ್ಲ, ನಮ್ಮ ಸಮಾಜನ ನಮಗೆ ಹೆಲ್ಪ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದು. ಯಾರೋ ನಮ್ಮ ಸಮಾಜದಲ್ಲಿ ಒಬ್ರು ಈ ಥರ ಈ ಆಫೀಸಲ್ಲಿ ಚೆಕ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ, ಹೋಗಿ ಮಾಡಿಸ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು. ಆದ್ದರಿಂದ ನಮ್ಮ ಆಧಾರ್ ಕಾರ್ಡ್ ನಾವು ತಗೊಂಡು ಬಂದು ನಮ್ಮ ಮೊಬೈಲ್ ನಂಬರ್ ಕೊಟ್ಟು ನಾವು ಇಂಜೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಮಾಡಿಸ್ಕೊಂಡು
ನಂಬರ್ 1, ನಂಬರ್ 2 ವ್ಯಾಕ್ಸಿನೇಷನ್ ತೊಗೊಂಡಿದ್ವಿ. ಬಟ್ ಯಾವುದೇ ರೀತಿಯಾದಂತಹ ಗೌರ್ಮೆಂಟಿಂದ ನಮಗೆ ಯಾವುದೇ ರೀತಿಯಾದಂತಹ ಸಪೋರ್ಟ್ ಆಗಲಿ ಸರ್ವಿಸ್ ಆಗಲಿ ಸಿಕ್ಕಿಲ್ಲ. ಗೌರ್ಮೆಂಟಿಂದ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಯಾವುದೇ ರೀತಿಯಾದಂತಹ ಸರ್ವಿಸಸ್ ಆಗ್ಬೋದು ಮತ್ತು ಸ್ಕೀಮ್ಸ್ ಆಗ್ಬೋದು ಯಾವುದೂ ನಮಗೆ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿಲ್ಲ. ನಾವು ತುಂಬ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಆಫೀಸ್ ಕಡೆಯಿಂದ ಪ್ರೆಷರ್ ಹಾಕಿದ್ವಿ, ಬಟ್ ಯಾವುದೇ ರೀತಿಯಾದಂತಹ ನಮಗೆ ಸೌಲಭ್ಯಗಳು ಗೌರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಕಡೆಯಿಂದ ನಮಗೂ ಸಿಕ್ಕಿಲ್ಲ. ನಾನು ರಿಕ್ವೆಸ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳೋದಿಷ್ಟೇ, ನಾವು ತುಂಬ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ಸಲ್ಲಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ನಮ್ಮಂಥ ಟ್ರಾನ್ಸ್ಜೆಂಡರ್ಸ್ ಆಗ್ಬೋದು, ವುಮೆನ್ಸ್ ಆಗ್ಬೋದು, ತುಂಬ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ಸಲ್ಲಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ಇನ್ಕಮಿಂಗ್ ಡೇಸ್ ಗೌರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಕಡೆಯಿಂದ ದಯವಿಟ್ಟು ನಮಗೆ ಯಾವುದೇ ರೀತಿಯಾದ ಸ್ಕೀಮ್ಸ್ ಆಗ್ಬೋದು ಅಥವಾ ಯಾವುದೇ ರೀತಿಯಾದಂತಹ ಸಪೋರ್ಟ್ ಆಗ್ಬೋದು ಮಾಡಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಕಳಕಳಿಯಾಗಿ ನಾವು ರಿಕ್ವೆಸ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಕೇಳ್ಕೊತೀವಿ.
ಕೋವಿಡ್ ಟೈಮಲ್ಲಿ ಸುಮಾರು ನಮ್ಮ ಸಮುದಾಯದವರು ತುಂಬ ಕಷ್ಟಕ್ಕೆ ಒಳಗಾಗಿದ್ರು. ಆ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಅವರಿಗೆ ರೇಷನ್ ಕೊಡೋದಾಗಿರ್ಬೋದು, ವ್ಯಾಕ್ಸಿನೇಷನ್ ಪ್ರೋಗ್ರಾಮನ್ನು ಕಂಡಕ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿರ್ಬೋದು, ಹೆಲ್ತ್ ಕ್ಯಾಂಪ್ಗಳನ್ನು ಕಂಡಕ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ ನಮ್ಮ ಸಮುದಾಯದವರಿಗೆ ಆರೋಗ್ಯದ ವಿಚಾರವಾಗಿ ಏನೆಲ್ಲ ಸೌಲಭ್ಯಗಳು ದೊರಕಬೇಕು ಅದನ್ನು ನಾವು ನಮ್ಮ ಸಮಾಜ ಸೊಸೈಟಿ ಯಶವಂತಪುರದಿಂದ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದೇವೆ. ಮತ್ತೆ ನಾವು ಹೇಳ್ಬೇಕಂತಂದ್ರೆ, ಸರ್ಕಾರದಿಂದ ಸಿಗುವಂತಹ ಎಲ್ಲ ಸೌಲಭ್ಯಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ನಮ್ಮ ಸಮುದಾಯದವರಿಗೆ ಆ ಸೌಲಭ್ಯಗಳು ದೊರಕಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ನಾವು ತುಂಬಾ ಶ್ರಮ ಪಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೇವೆ. ನಮ್ಮ ಸಮುದಾಯದವರಿಗೆ ಒಂದು ವಸತಿ ಯೋಜನೆ ಅಡಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಅವ್ರಿಗೊಂದೊಂದು ಮನೆ ಸಿಗ್ಬೇಕು. ಯಾಕಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಕೋವಿಡ್ ನಂತ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ನೋಡಿದ್ರೆ ಎಷ್ಟೋ ಜನ ಮನೆಯನ್ನ ಖಾಲಿ ಮಾಡಿ ಬೀದಿಗೆ ಬಂದಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಸೊ ಆದ ಕಾರಣ ಅವ್ರಿಗೂ ಒಂದು ಮನೆ ಸಿಗ್ಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನೋದು ನಮ್ಮ ಮುಖ್ಯ ಉದ್ದೇಶ.
ನಮಗೆ ಒಂದು ಕೆಲಸ ಕೊಡಿ, ಒಂದು ಮನೆ ಕೊಡಿ, ತಿಂಗಳಿಗೆ 5,000 ಪೆನ್ಷನ್ ಕೊಡಿ. ನಾವು ಅವಾಗ ಸೆಕ್ಸ್ ವರ್ಕು ಮಾಡಲ್ಲ, ಭಿಕ್ಷೆನೂ ಬೇಡಲ್ಲ. ಸಮಾಜದಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾವ ಥರ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ, ಮೇನ್ ಸ್ಟ್ರೀಮಲ್ಲಿ ಜನ ಯಾವ ಥರ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ, ನಾವು ಅದೇ ಥರ ಬದುಕ್ತೀವಿ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳೋಕ್ಕೆ ಇಷ್ಟಪಡ್ತೀನಿ.
ಸೊಸೈಟಿಲಿ ಕೇಳ್ಕೊಳೋದು ಇಷ್ಟೇ, ನಮ್ಮ ಥರ ಜನ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ, ನಮ್ಮ ಥರ ಟ್ರಾನ್ಸ್ ವುಮೆನ್ಸ್ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ, ನಮ್ಮ ಥರ ಟ್ರಾನ್ಸ್ಜೆಂಡರ್ಸ್ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ, ಪ್ಲೀಸ್ ರೆಸ್ಪೆಕ್ಟ್ ದೆಮ್. ಆಮೇಲೆ ನಮ್ಮಂಥವ್ರಿಗೂ ಕೂಡ ದಯವಿಟ್ಟು ಒಂದೊಂದು ಒಳ್ಳೊಳ್ಳೆ ಕೆಲಸ ಕೊಡಿ, ಗೌರ್ಮೆಂಟಿಂದ ಸ್ಕೀಮ್ಸ್ ಕೊಡಿ, ಆಮೇಲೆ ನಮಗೆ ಬೇಕಾದಂತಹ ಫೆಸಿಲಿಟೀಸ್ನ, ಸರ್ವಿಸ್ನ, ಸೌಲಭ್ಯಗಳನ್ನ ದಯವಿಟ್ಟು ಕೊಡಿ ಅಂತ ನಾವು ಕೇಳ್ಕೊತೀವಿ. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಪ್ಲೀಸ್ ನಮ್ಮನ್ನ ಕೂಡ ಒಂದು ಹ್ಯೂಮನ್ ಬೀಯಿಂಗ್ ಆಗಿ ಕನ್ಸಿಡರ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಅಂತ ಈ ಸೊಸೈಟಿಗೆ ನಾವು ಕೇಳ್ಕೊತೀವಿ.
ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ಬಂದ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಈ ಸಮಾಜದಲ್ಲಿ ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ಒಬ್ಬರು ಇದಾಗಿ ನೀವು ಇದು ಮಾಡಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ನಾವು ಇದು ಮಾಡಿ, ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ಬಂದ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ತುಂಬ ನೀವು ತುಳಿತೀರಾ, ದಯವಿಟ್ಟು ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ತುಳಿಬೇಡಿ ಅಂತ ನಾವು ಕೇಳ್ಕೊಳ್ತೀವಿ.
We will also be playing the second winning documentary.
And there was a great calm, the likes of which one could never believe would be possible after all the turbulence of our nation triggered by the demonetization, recorded high unemployment rates, sluggish GDP growth rate, socio-political feuds, farmer movements, uprisings, climate change, etc., put a great deal of pressure on the common man. But 2020, the decadal year, the hopes of the people stacked against the tide of impossibility, was quick to be shattered because there's always a great calm before the storm.
Thank you so much, Tina and Chitu Kartikanu. Good way, Sana, I want to perform Bandinga Roman and Mali.
World closed her eyes. Nowhere else on earth that nobody lies. Only you could hear the poor cries, hunger to find great joys. When the future breaks the history of 2020, the pandemic played the role of dictatorship and the rest were his slaves. Major feeling that emulates during those tumultuous times were cry, cry, cry. The struggle of transgenders who were part and the victim of the pandemic during the lockdown period.
ನಾನು ಗೌರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಏನು ಹೇಳೋಕ್ಕೆ ಇಷ್ಟಪಡೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಗೌರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೋ ಬಿಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೋ, ಬಟ್ ನಮ್ಗೆ ತಲುಪಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂದರೂ ಬೇರೆಯವ್ರಿಗೆಲ್ಲ ತಲುಪಿರತ್ತೆ. ಯಾಕಂದರೆ ನಾವು ಕೊಟ್ಟೇ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅನ್ನೋದನ್ನ ಅದು ತಪ್ಪಾಗತ್ತೆ. ಕೊಟ್ಟಿರ್ಬೋದು, ನಮಗೆ ಅದು ತಲುಪಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂದರೂ ಬೇರೆ ನಮ್ಮಂಥವ್ರಿಗೆ ಎಷ್ಟೋ ಜನಕ್ಕೆ ತಲುಪಿರತ್ತೆ. ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಗೌರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಮೇಲೆ ಹೇಳೋಕ್ಕೆ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಇಷ್ಟ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಬಟ್ ನಾವೆಲ್ಲ ತುಂಬ ಕಷ್ಟಪಟ್ಟಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ನಮಗೆ ಲಾಕ್ಡೌನ್ 3 ತಿಂಗಳಾಗಿತ್ತು. ಆ ಟೈಮಲ್ಲಿ ತುಂಬ ಊಟ ಮಾಡೋಕ್ಕೆ ನಮ್ಗೆ ತುಂಬ ಕಷ್ಟ ಆಯಿತು. ನಾವು 15 ಜನ, ಒಂದು ದಿನಕ್ಕೆ 15 ಜನ ಊಟ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಂದ್ರೆ ಬೆಳಗ್ಗೆ ಸಂಜೆ ಮಧ್ಯಾಹ್ನ ಸಂಜೆ ಟೈಮಲ್ಲಿ ನ್ಯಾಕ್ಸ್ ತಿನ್ನಬೇಕು. ನಾವು ಹಂಗೆ ಎಲ್ಲ ಬೆಳಕೋ ಬಂದಿರೋರು. ಏಕ್ದಮ್ ಒಂದು ರೂಮಲ್ಲಿ ಹಾಕಿ ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ಕೂಡಾಕಿರೋ ಥರನೇ ಲಾಕ್ಡೌನ್ ಇತ್ತು. ಆವಾಗ ನಾವೇನು ಮಾಡಬೇಕು? ಗ್ಯಾಸ್ ತಗೋಬೇಕು, ಒಳ್ಳೆಯದು ಕೆಟ್ಟದ್ದು ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಂದು ತಗೋಬೇಕು. 15 ಜನ ಊಟ ಮಾಡೋದಂದರೆ ಕಡಿಮೆ ಏನಲ್ವಾ? ಅದು ತುಂಬ ಕಷ್ಟವಾದಿದ್ದು. ಇವಾಗ 15 ಜನಕ್ಕೆ ಇವಾಗ ಲಾಕ್ಡೌನ್ ಇಲ್ಲ, ಎಲ್ಲರೂ ಹೊರಗಡೆ ಹೋಗ್ತಾರೆ, ಅಲ್ಲೆಲ್ಲ ಟೀ ಕಾಫಿ ಕುಡ್ಕೊತಾರೆ. ಅದರಿಂದ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಯಾವುದು ಗೊತ್ತಾಗಲ್ಲ. ಇವಾಗ ನಾವು 15 ಜನ ಮನೇಲಿ ಇರೋದ್ರಿಂದ ಬೆಳಗ್ಗೆ ಎದ್ದು ನಾವು 3 ಲೀಟ್ರ್ 4 ಲೀಟ್ರ್ ಹಾಲು ತೊಗೋಬೇಕು. ಮತ್ತು ಟೈಮ್ ಇದ್ದಾಗ ಮತ್ತೆ ಹಾಲು ತೊಗೋಬೇಕು. ಹಂಗೆ ಹಾಲು ನಮ್ಗೊಂದು ದಿನಕ್ಕೆ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂದರೂ 5 ಲೀಟ್ರ್ ಹಾಲು ಬೇಕಾಗಿತ್ತು. ಮತ್ತು ಅದು ಒಳ್ಳೆಯದು ಕೆಟ್ಟದ್ದು ಸಕ್ಕರೆ ಇರಲಿ ಏನೇ ಇರಲಿ ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಂದು ಊಟ ಮಾಡೋದಂದರೆ ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಂದು ಆಳು ಕಾಳು ಮಾಲು ಎಲ್ಲನೂ ತೊಗೋಬೇಕಾಗಿತ್ತು. ಅದರಿಂದ ನಾವು ತುಂಬ ಕಷ್ಟಪಟ್ಟಿದ್ವಿ. ಲಾಕ್ಡೌನಲ್ಲಂತೂ ನಾವು ಒಂದೊಂದು ಟೈಮಲ್ಲೂ ಕೆಲವರು ಬಂದುಬಿಟ್ಟು ಡ್ರಿಂಕ್ಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಿದ್ರು. ನಮ್ಮದ್ರಲ್ಲಿ ಮೈನ್ ಅದೇ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ಮು. ಪಾಪ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಡ್ರಿಂಕ್ಸ್ ಸಿಗ್ತಿದ್ದಿಲ್ಲ. ಕೆಲವರು ತುಂಬ ವಯಸ್ಸಾದವರು, ಅವ್ರಂತೂ ಏನು ಮಾಡೋಕ್ಕಾಗಲ್ಲ. ಅಂಥ ಟೈಮಲ್ಲಿ ಅವ್ರ ಪಾಪ ರೊಟ್ಟಿ ಕುಡಿಯೋಕ್ಕಾಗಲ್ಲ, ಡ್ರಿಂಕ್ಸ್ ಮಾಡೋಕ್ಕಾಗಲ್ಲ ಅಂದ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಕೈ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಶೇಕ್ ಆಗ್ತಿತ್ತು. ನಾವು ಆ ಟೈಮಲ್ಲಿ 2,000 3,000 ಮಾರ್ತಿದ್ರು ಒಂದೊಂದು ಕ್ವಾರ್ಟ್ರನ್ನ. ನಾವು ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಗಿ ತಗೊಳ್ಳೋದು? ನಮ್ಮ ಕೈಲಿ ಅದೆಲ್ಲ ತಗೊಳಕ್ಕೆ ಆಗ್ತಿಲ್ಲ, ಕೊಡೋಕ್ಕೂ ಆಗ್ತಿದ್ದಿಲ್ಲ. ಅಂಥ ಟೈಮಲ್ಲಿ ಪಾಪ ಅವರು ತುಂಬ ಕಷ್ಟಪಟ್ಟು, ಅವರಂತಿಲ್ಲ ನಾವೆಲ್ಲರೂ ಅಷ್ಟೇ, ನಾವು ತುಂಬ ಕಷ್ಟಪಟ್ಟಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ನಮ್ಗೆ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಅಕ್ಕಿ ಬೇಳೆ ಸಿಕ್ತಿತ್ತು, ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ನಾವು ಹೇಳೋಕ್ಕಾಗಲ್ಲ. ಆದರೆ ಅಷ್ಟು ಜನಕ್ಕೂ ಸಿಕ್ಕಿಲ್ಲ. ಬಟ್ ಒಬ್ರಿಗೆ ಸಿಕ್ಕಿರೋದನ್ನ ನಾವು ಅಷ್ಟು ಜನ ಹಂಚ್ಕೊಂಡು ತಿಂದಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ಬಟ್ ಅಷ್ಟಾದರೆ ನಮಗೇನು ಫೆಸಿಲಿಟಿ ಏನು ಯಾರ ಕಡೆಯಿಂದ ನಮಗೇನು ಯಾವುದು ಬಂದು ನಮ್ಗೆ ಯಾರು ಏನು ಮಾಡಿಲ್ಲ. ನಾವು ದುಡ್ದಿದ್ದೀವಿ, ನಾವು ತಿಂದಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ಲಾಕ್ಡೌನಲ್ಲೂ ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ನೋಡಿ ಅಯ್ಯೋ ಪಾಪ ಇವ್ರಿಗೆ ಯಾರು ಕೊಡೋರು ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಬಂದು ಹೊರಗಡೆಯಿಂದ ಎಷ್ಟೋ ಜನ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಬಂದು ಹೆಲ್ಪ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಪಾಪ ಅವರೆಲ್ಲ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿರ್ಬೇಕಂತ ನಾನು ಹೇಳ್ಕೊತೀನಿ. ಯಾರೋ ಅವ್ರ ಹಿಂದೆ ಕಣೆ ಮುಂದೆ ಕಣೆ, ಅಯ್ಯೋ ಪಾಪ ಅವ್ರು ಅಲ್ಲೇ ಕೂತಿರ್ತಾರೆ, ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಯಾರು ಕೊಡ್ತಾರೆ ಅಂದ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಎಷ್ಟೋ ಜನ ಅನ್ನ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಅಕ್ಕಿ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಬೇಳೆ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಅಂಥದ್ದು ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಆದರೆ ದೊಡ್ಡ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿಗಳು, ಗಣ್ಯ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿಗಳೆಲ್ಲ ನಮಗೆ ಏನು ನಮ್ಗೆ ಹೆಲ್ಪ್ ಮಾಡಿಲ್ಲ. ನಮ್ಮವರೆಗೂ ಎಲ್ರಿಗೂ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಬಿಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಗೊತ್ತಿಲ್ಲ. ಬಟ್ ನಮ್ಮವ್ರಿಗೂ ಯಾರು ನಮಗೇನು ಕೊಟ್ಟಿಲ್ಲ. ಅಕ್ಕಿ ಬೇಳೆ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಜನ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅದು ಬಿಟ್ಟರೆ ಸೊಸೈಟಿಯಿಂದ ನಮ್ಗೆ ನಮಗೇನು ಕೊಟ್ಟಿಲ್ಲ, ಯಾರೇನು ಕೊಟ್ಟಿಲ್ಲ, ಹೆಲ್ಪ್ ಮಾಡಿಲ್ಲ. ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರಲ್ಲ, ನಾವು 15 ದಿನಕ್ಕೆ ಆಗೋಷ್ಟು ಅನ್ನಕ್ಕೆ ಸಾರಿಗೆ ಉಪ್ಪುಗೆ ಹುಳಿಗೆ ಏನು ಬೇಕೋ ನಾವು ಅದನ್ನು ಒಂದಿನ ಮುಂಚೆ ಫುಲ್ ತೊಗೊಬಂದು ನಾವು 15 ದಿನಕ್ಕೆ ಬೇಕಾಗೋದನ್ನ ತೊಗೊಬಂದು ಮಡಗಿದ್ವು. ಬಟ್ ಅದು 15 ದಿನ ಆದಮೇಲೆ ನಮಗೆ ತುಂಬ ಕಷ್ಟ ಬಂತು. 15 ದಿನವರೆಗೂ ನಾವೆಲ್ಲ ಮಡಗಿದ್ವು. ಹಾಲು ಒಂದು ಬಿಟ್ಟರೆ ಮಿಕ್ಕಿದ ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಂದು ಸ್ಟಾಕ್ ಇತ್ತು ನಮ್ಮ ಮನೇಲಿ. ಈ 15 ದಿನ ಆದಮೇಲೆ ಅವ್ರು 21 ದಿನ ಹಾಕಿದ್ರಲ್ವ, ಮತ್ತು 7 ದಿನ ಹಾಕಿದ್ರಲ್ಲ, ಆವಾಗ 7 ದಿನದಲ್ಲಿ ನಮ್ಗೆ ತುಂಬ ಕಷ್ಟ. ಯಾಕಂದರೆ ಹೋಗಿ ತಗೋಬರೋಕ್ಕಾಗ್ತಿದ್ದಿಲ್ಲ, ನಾವು ಹೊರಗಡೆ ಹೋಗೋಕ್ಕಾಗ್ತಿಲ್ಲ, ಒಳಗಡೆನೇ ಇರ್ತಿದ್ವು. ಈ ರೋಡಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಕೂತ್ಕೊತಿದ್ರೆ ಪೊಲೀಸರು ಬಂದು ಅನೌನ್ಸ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಮಾಡಿಕೊಂಡು ಒಳಗಡೆ ಹೋಗ್ರಿ ಅಂತ. ಕರೆಂಟ್ ಇರೋದಿಲ್ಲ, ಸಣ್ಣ ಟೈಮಲ್ಲಿ ಕರೆಂಟ್ ಇರೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ನಾವೇನು ಮಾಡೋದು ಅಂತ ಟೈಮಲ್ಲಿ? ಟಿ ವಿ ನೋಡೋಣ ಅಂದರೆ ರೀಚಾರ್ಜ್ ಮಾಡೋಕ್ಕೆ ಅಂಗಡಿಗಳಿಲ್ಲ. ಇಂಥದ್ದೆಲ್ಲ ಸುಮಾರು ನಾವು ಕಷ್ಟಗಳಂತೂ ಸುಮಾರು ಪಟ್ಟಿದ್ದೀವಿ ಅಂಥದ್ದು. ನಮ್ಮ ಜನಗಳು ಬೇಕಾದಂಗೆ ಊಟ ಇಲ್ಲದೆ ತಿಂಡಿ ಇಲ್ಲದೆ ಬಸ್ ಸ್ಟಾಪಲ್ಲಿ ಮಲಗಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಆ ಟೈಮಲ್ಲಿ ಈ ಪೊರ್ಕಿ ಹುಡುಗರು ಲಾಕ್ಡೌನು ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಓಪನ್ ಆಗಿತ್ತಲ್ವ, ಅಂಥ ಟೈಮಲ್ಲೂ ಈ 2 ವೀಲರ್ ಹೋಗೋರು ಬರೋರು ರೇಗ್ಸೋದು ಹೊಡಿಯೋದು, ನಿಮ್ಗಳಿಗೆ ಬೇರೆ ಏನು ಗತಿಲ್ವಾ ಅಂತ, ಇಂಥದ್ದೆಲ್ಲ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಲೈಫಲ್ಲಿ ತುಂಬ ನಡೆದಿದೆ. ಲಾಕ್ಡೌನ್ ಟೈಮಲ್ಲೂ ನಡೆದಿದೆ. ಅಂಥ ಟೈಮಲ್ಲಿ ನಮಗೆ ಕಾಲ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಹಿಂಗೆ ನಡೀತಾ ಇದೆ, ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು 3 ಜನ 4 ಜನ ಅರೆಸ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಹೊಡಿತಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ನೀವು ಬನ್ನಿ ಅಂತ. ಅಂಥ ಟೈಮ್ ನಮ್ಮ ಹತ್ರ ಗಾಡಿ ಇಲ್ಲ, ನಾವಂತೂ ಯಾರಾದ್ರೂ ಗಾಡಿ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡಿಲ್ಲ. ಆಟೋ ಬರ್ತಿಲ್ಲ, ಆಟೋ ಬಂದರೆ ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ಹಿಡಿದು ಬಿಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಇಂಥದ್ದು ನಡೆಯುತ್ತೆ. ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಲಾಕ್ಡೌನಲ್ಲಿ ನಮ್ಮ ದೊಡ್ಡವರೊಬ್ಬರು ಮೂಡ್ರಪಾಳ್ಯದಲ್ಲಿ ತೀರ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ರು. ದೊಡ್ಡವರವರು ಲಾಕ್ಡೌನ್ ಟೈಮಲ್ಲಿ ಕೊರೋನಾ ಬಂದವ್ರು ತೀರ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ರು. ಅವ್ರಿಗೊಂದು 80 ವರ್ಷ ಇರ್ಬೋದು. ಬಟ್ ಅವ್ರು ತುಂಬ ಸೀನಿಯರ್. ಆದರೆ ಅವ್ರನ್ನ ನೋಡೋಕೆ ನಾವು ಹೋಗ್ಬೇಕಾಗಿತ್ತು. ಅಂಥ ಮೂಮೆಂಟಲ್ಲಿ ಇಲ್ಲಿಂದ ನಾವು ಹಂಗೋ ಹಿಂಗೋ ಒಂದು ಆಟೋ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಹೋದರೆ ನಾಯಂಡಹಳ್ಳಿ ಹತ್ರ ಹೋಗಿ ಇಲ್ಲ ದೇವೇಗೌಡ ಪೆಟ್ರೋಲ್ ಬಂಕ್ ಹತ್ರ ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ಸಿಗ್ನಲಲ್ಲಿ ಸ್ಟಾಪ್ ಲಾಕ್ ಮಾಡಿಬಿಟ್ರು. ನಾವಂದು ಸಾರ್ ನೋಡಿ ಸಾರ್ ನಾವು ಹಿಂಗೆ ಸಾವು ಹೋಗ್ತಾ ಇದ್ವಿ ಅಂದ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ನಾವು ವಾಟ್ಸಪ್ ತೋರಿಸಿದ್ರು. ಬಟ್ ನಾವು ಅವ್ರು ಮೂವ್ ಮಾಡೋಕ್ಕೆ ಬಿಡ್ತಿಲ್ಲ. ಇಲ್ಲ ನೀವು ತಿರುಗಿ ವಾಪಸ್ ಹೋಗಿ ಅಂತ. ಬಟ್ ನಮ್ಮ ಹಿಂದೆ ಬಂದವರೆಲ್ಲ ಹೋಯ್ತವ್ರೆ, ಬಟ್ ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ಅವ್ರು ಹೋಗೋಕ್ಕೆ ಬಿಡ್ತಿಲ್ಲ. ತಿರುಗ್ರಿ ಅಂದ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ನಾವು ತುಂಬ ಕೇಳ್ಕೊಂಡು ನೋಡಿ ಸರ್ ನಾವು ಮತ್ತೆ ಅವ್ರು ನಮ್ಮ ಮುಖ ಸಿಗೋದಿಲ್ಲ, ನಾವು ಹೋಗ್ತೀವಿ ಅಂದರೆ ಬಿಟ್ಟಿಲ್ಲ, ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ವಾಪಸ್ ಕಳಿಸಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಲಾಕ್ಡೌನ್ ಟೈಮಲ್ಲಿ. ಅಂಥದ್ದೆಲ್ಲ ನಮ್ಮ ಲೈಫಲ್ಲಿ ಲಾಕ್ಡೌನ್ ಟೈಮಲ್ಲೇ ನಡೆಯತ್ತಂತಿಲ್ಲ. ಈಗ ಜಸ್ಟ್ ನಾವು 3-4 ಜನ ಈಚೆ ಹೋಗ್ತಿದ್ರೆ ಬಸ್ ಸ್ಟಾಪಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾಲ್ ಹತ್ರ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಅದನ್ನು ನಡೀತಾನೇ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ನಮಗೆ ನಾವು ಅದನ್ನು ನೋಡಿ ಏನು ಹೇಳೋದು, ನೋಡಿ ನಾವು ಅದನ್ನು ಈ ಕಿವಿಗೆ ಈ ಕಣ್ಣಲ್ಲಿ ನೋಡ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಈ ಕೈಯಲ್ಲಿ ಬಿಟ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಹೋಗ್ತಾನೇ ಇರ್ತೀವಿ.
The LGBTQIA community narrates the harassments they face daily on the public places. They feel less insecure of their lives. All they want is the acceptance from the society for proudly being who they are. They wish if there was a world with no discrimination. There is a spectrum of sexualities and people within the LGBTQIA community, yet people do not recognize this.
ಈಗ ನಾವು ನಮ್ಮ ಅಮ್ಮ ಅಂಗಡಿಗೆ ಹೋಗಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ಆಗ ರೋಡಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಗುವಾಗ ನಮ್ಮನ್ನ ಆ ಥರ ಕೇಳಿದರು. ನಾವು ಹೇಳಿದೆ, ಇಲ್ಲ ನಾನು ಮಾಲೆ ಹಾಕಿದ್ದೀನಿ ತಾನೇ, ಯಾಕೆ ನಮ್ಮನ್ನ ಕೇಳ್ತೀರಾ ಅಂತ. ಇದೇ ಹುಡುಗಿರು ಬೇರೆಯವರು ಅಂದರೆ ನಿಮ್ಮವ್ರನ್ನ ಹೋಗಿ ಕೇಳಲ್ಲ ತಾನೆ, ಯಾಕೆ ನಮ್ಮನ್ನ ಮಾತ್ರ ಆ ಥರ ಕೇಳೋದು? ನಾವು ನಿಮ್ಮ ಕಣ್ಣಿಗೆ ಕಾಣಿಸಲ್ವಾ? ನಾವು ಮನುಷ್ಯರು ತಾನೆ, ನಾವು ಅದನ್ನೇ ಕೇಳ್ತಾ ಇರೋದು, ನಮ್ಮದು ಬೇರೆ ಯಾವುದಿಲ್ಲ. ನಾವು ಮನುಷ್ಯರು, ನಾವು ಮಾಲೆ ಹಾಕಿದ್ದೀವಿ, ನಾವು ದೇವ್ರು ಅಂತ ಮುಗಿತೀವಿ, ನೀವು ದೇವ್ರು ಅಂತ ಮುಗಿತೀರ. ಇದೇ ನಿಮ್ಮಂಥವ್ರು ಹುಡುಗಿರ ಹತ್ರ ಹೋಗಿ ಕೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ಅವ್ರು ಬಿಡ್ತಾರಾ?
ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಹೋಗ್ತಿದ್ವಿ ನಾವು ಇಬ್ಬರು, ತಾಯಿ ಮಗಳಿಬ್ಬರು ಹೋಗ್ತಿದ್ರು. ರೋಡ್ ಕ್ರಾಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ನಾವು ಬಟ್ಟೆ ತಗೊಳಕ್ಕೆ ಹೋಗ್ತಿದ್ವು. ನಮ್ಮ ನೋಡಿ ಆರ ನೋಡ್ದ. ಈ ರೋಡಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಗ್ಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ನಮ್ಮ ನೋಡಿ ಆರ ನೋಡ್ದ. ನಾವು ಆ ಕಡೆ ಅವ್ನು ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಗ್ಬೇಕೋ ಗೊತ್ತಿಲ್ಲ, ಬಟ್ ನಮ್ಮ ನೋಡಿ ಏನು ಮಾಡ್ದ, ಯೂ ಟರ್ನ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಬಂದ ಬಸ್ ಸ್ಟಾಪ್ ಹತ್ರ. ಬಂದಿದ ತಕ್ಷಣ ಅವ್ನು ನಮ್ಮನ್ನ ಓಪನ್ ಆಗೇ ಕೇಳ್ದ. ಅದು ಇದು ಎಲ್ಲ ಕೇಳಿಲ್ಲ, ನಾನು ನಿನ್ನ ಹತ್ರ ಸೆಕ್ಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೋಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಕೇಳ್ದ. ನಾವೊಂದು ಇವಳಂತೂ ಮಾತಾಡೋಕ್ಕಾಗಿಲ್ಲ, ದೇವ್ರ ಬಟ್ಟೆ ಹಾಕಿಲ್ಲ. ನಾನು ಏನು ಮಾತಾಡಿಲ್ಲ, ನಾನು ಏನು ಮಾತಾಡೋಕ್ಕಾಗ್ತಿಲ್ಲ, ಯಾಕಂದರೆ ಪಬ್ಲಿಕಲ್ಲಿ ಏನು ಮಾತಾಡೋದು ಅಂದ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ನಾವು ಸುಮ್ಮನೆ ಏನೋ ಇವಾಗ ನೀನು ನನ್ನ ಗುರ್ತಿದ್ಯಾ ಅಂದ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಆ ಥರನೇ ನಾನು ನಿಮ್ಮ ಹತ್ರ ಮಾತಾಡಬೇಕಾಗತ್ತೆ. ಇವು ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಬಸ್ ಸ್ಟಾಪ್ ಹತ್ರ ಜನ ಅವರೇ, ಅದರಿಂದ ಏನೋ ನೀನು ನನಗೆ ಪರಿಚಯ ಇದೆಯಾ ಅಂದ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ನಾನು ನಿನ್ನ ಹತ್ರ ಮಾತಾಡ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಒಂಚೂರು ಗೊತ್ತಾಗೋದು ಬೇಡ. ಅಂದರೆ ಅವ್ನಿಗೆ ಏನಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು ಅವನು ಅದನ್ನು ತಲೆಗೆ ಹತ್ಕೊಂತಿಲ್ಲ. ಅದರಿಂದ ನಾವು ಈಚೆ ಬಾರಿ ಅಂದ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ನಾವು ಒನ್ ವೇ ಈ ಕಡೆ ಹೋಗ್ತಾ ಇದ್ವು ಅಲ್ವಾ, ಅದು ಒನ್ ವೇ. ನಾನೇನು ಮಾಡಿಬಿಟ್ಟು ಈ ಕಡೆ ಕರ್ಕೊಂಡ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಮತ್ತೆ ಯೂಟರ್ನ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋಕ್ಕಾಗಲ್ಲ. ಇಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಬಂದು ಹಿಂಗೆ ಯೂಟರ್ನ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡ, ಮತ್ತೆ ಹಿಂಗೆ ಯೂಟರ್ನ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋಕ್ಕಾಗೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ನಾವೇ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಹಿಂಗೆ ಕೆಳಗಡೆ ಡೌನ್ ಬಂದೆ, ಅವ್ನು ಆರ ನೋಡಿತಾನೇ ಇದ್ದ. ನಾನು ಇವಳ ಹತ್ರ ಹೇಳ್ಕೊಂಡೇ ಬಂದೆ, ಏನೇ ಪ್ರಪಂಚ, ನಾನು ಇವಳ ಹತ್ರ ಹೇಳ್ತಿದ್ದೆ, ಇವಳಿಗೆ ಅಷ್ಟಾರ ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗಿಲ್ಲ. ನಾನು ಹೇಳ್ತಿದ್ದೆ, ದೇವ್ರು ಅಂತ ನಾವು ಮಾಲೆ ಹಾಕೋದ್ರ ಜನಗಳು ನಮ್ಮನ್ನ ಕೆಟ್ಟ ಇದರಿಂದ ನಮ್ಮನ್ನ ಬಿಡಕ್ಕಾಗ್ತಿಲ್ಲ ನೋಡು ಅಂತ. ಇವಾಗ ನಾವೇನ್ ಮಾಡೋಕ್ಕಾಗತ್ತೆ? ಹೌದಾ ಆಯ್ತು, ಹೋಗಿ ಒಂದು ಸುಮ್ಮನೆ ಯಾವುದೋ ಒಂದು ಅಡ್ರೆಸ್ ಹೇಳಿ ಹಿಂಗೆ ಸುತ್ಕೊಂಡು ಹಿಂಗೆ ಬಾ, ನಾವು ಹಿಂಗಿಂದ ಹಿಂಗೆ ಬರ್ತೀವಿ ಅಂದ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ನಾವು ಸುಮ್ಮನೆ ಆಟ ಆಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಹೋಗ್ತಾನೆ.
Every day, members of the LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender community are harassed, assaulted, brutally victimized, and unfortunately in many cases killed for who they are and what they stand for. The number of people coming out as a non-heterosexual individual rise every day. However, fear still holds people back from happy, successful lives. It may not seem like a huge deal to some, but for LGBT people, hiding who they are in living as a sale of what they can potentially be. Members of LGBT are suppressed by what society expects them to be and are terrified of how some would react if they don't fill the mold.
ಹಿಂಗೆ ನಮ್ಮ ಲೈಫಲ್ಲಿ ಇವತ್ತವರೆಗೂ ನಾವು ಕೆಲ್ಸಕ್ಕೆ ಹೋದ್ರೂ ಲೈಫಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾವುದೋ ಒಂದು ಮೂಲೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ನಮ್ಗಳಿಗಿಂತ ಹರಾಸ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಇವತ್ತಿಗೂ ನಡೀತಾನೇ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. 10 ಜನ ಸೇರ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋದು, ಊಟ ಮಾಡೋ ಜಾಗದಲ್ಲಿ ಬಂದದ್ದು ಏನೈತೆ ತೋರಿಸು ನಿನ್ನ ಹತ್ರ. ಹುಡುಗಿರ ಹತ್ರ ಏನಿದೆ ಅದನ್ನೇ ನಮ್ಮ ಹತ್ರ ಇರೋದು. ಒಂದು ತಾಯಿ ಒಂದು ಮಗುಗೆ ಏನು ಹಾಲು ಕೊಡ್ತಾಳೋ ಅದನ್ನೇ ನಮ್ಮ ಹತ್ರ ಇರೋದು. ಒಂದು ತಾಯಿ ಒಂದು ಮಗುನ ಯಾವ ಜಾಗದಲ್ಲಿ ಎತ್ತುತ್ತಾಳೋ ಅದೇ ಜಾಗನೂ ನಮಗೂ ಇರೋದು. ನಮಗೇನು ದೇವ್ರೇನು ಡಿಫ್ರೆಂಟ್ ಮಾಡಿಲ್ಲ. ಏನಂದರೆ ನಮಗೆ ಧ್ವನಿ ಇರ್ಬೋದು, ನಾವು ರೋಡ್ ಭಿಕ್ಷೆ ಮಾಡ್ಬೋದು, ಎರಡನೇದು ನಾವು ಸೆಕ್ಸ್ ವರ್ಕ್ ಮಾಡ್ಬೋದು. ಇದು ಬಿಟ್ಟರೆ ನಾವು ನಿಮ್ಮಂಥ ನಾರ್ಮಲ್ ಜನನೇ. ನಮಗೂ ಕೂದಲಿದೆ, ಕಣ್ಣಿದೆ, ಕಾಲಿದೆ, ಚೆಸ್ಟ್ ಇದೆ, ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಂದಿದೆ. ನಮಗೂ ಯಾವುದೇನು ದೇವ್ರು ಕೊಟ್ಟಿಲ್ಲ. ಏನಂದರೆ ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ಯಾರೂ ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊತಿಲ್ಲ ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಜನಗಳು. ಒಂದು 9 ಗಂಟೆ ಮೇಲೆ ನಾವು ಈಚೆ ಹೋದರೆ ಅವ್ರು ಯಾವ ಮುತ್ಕ ಇರಲಿ ಯಾರೇ ಇರಲಿ, ಹುಡುಗ ಇರಲಿ ಯಾರೇ ಇರಲಿ, ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ಸೆಕ್ಸ್ ಮಾಡೋಕ್ಕೆ ಕರೀತಾರೆ ಹೊರತು ನೀವೇನು ಅಂತ ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ಯೂಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಬೆಳಗ್ಗೆ ಅಂತೂ ಇವಾಗ ಹೋಗುವಾಗ ನಾರ್ಮಲ್ ಇವಾಗ ಅವರು ಇವರು ಪಬ್ಲಿಕ್ ನೋಡತ್ತಂತೆ ಹೋಗ್ತಾರೆ. ಬಟ್ ನೈಟ್ ನಾವು ಹೊರಗಡೆ ಹೋದರೆ ಆಟೋದಲ್ಲಿ ಹತ್ತು ಕೂತ್ಕೊಂಡ್ರು ಆಟೋದವ್ರು ನಮ್ಮನ್ನ ಹತ್ರ ಅದೇ ನಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋದು. ಎಲ್ಲ ಆಟೋದವ್ರು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳೋಕ್ಕಾಗಲ್ಲ, ಕೆಲವರು ಆಟೋದವ್ರು ನಮ್ಮನ್ನ ಹಂಗಂತಾರೆ, ಇಷ್ಟು ರಾತ್ರಿಗೆ ಎಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ಹೋಗ್ತಿದ್ಯಾ, ಏನಕ್ಕೆ ಹೋಗ್ತಿದ್ಯಾ ಅಂತ. ನಾವು ಏನು ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು ಅವ್ರು ನಂಬೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಕೆಲವು ಟೈಮಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಹೇಳಿದ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಹೋದ್ರೆ ನಮ್ಮ ಹಿಂದೆನೇ ಬಂದ್ಬಿಡ್ತಾರೆ ಆಟೋದವರು. ಆವಾಗ ಅಕ್ಕಪಕ್ಕದವ್ರು ಏನು ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ, ಡಿಸ್ಟರ್ಬ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಕ್ಕಪಕ್ಕದವರು. ಇಂಥವ್ರು ಇರೋದ್ರಿಂದನೇ ಈ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ ಸ್ಟಾರ್ಟ್ ಆಗತ್ತೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಮನೆ ಖಾಲಿ ಮಾಡಿಸ್ಬಿಡ್ತಾರೆ. ನಾವು ಸುಮ್ಮನೆ ಇದ್ರೂ ಪಬ್ಲಿಕ್ ಸುಮ್ಮನೆ ಇರೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ನೋಡಿ ಅದನ್ನೇ ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ಒಂದು ಸೆಕ್ಸ್ ವರ್ಕ್ ಮಾಡೋಕ್ಕೆ ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ಇಷ್ಟಪಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಅವರು ದೇವರೇ ಇರಲಿ ಏನೇ ಇರಲಿ, ಅವ್ರು ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ನೋಡೋ ಕಣ್ಣು ಅವ್ರದ್ದು ಒಂದೇ ಕಣ್ಣು. ನಾವು ನಿಮ್ಮನ್ನು ಸೆಕ್ಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ. ಮೆಡಿಕಲ್ ಅಂತೂ ಕೊಡೋದೇ ಇಲ್ಲ, ಚಪ್ಲಿಂಗ್ ಅಂಗಡಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಕೊಡೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಇನ್ನು ಬಿಸ್ನೆಸ್ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂತಾರೆ. ಯಾರೋ ನಮ್ಮ ನೋಡಿ ಅಯ್ಯೋ ಪಾಪ ಅಂತ ಕೊಡೋರು ಇದ್ದಾರೆ ಹೊತ್ತು ಮೆಡಿಕಲ್ಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾರು ಕೊಡೋದಿಲ್ಲ.
All have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. It was a challenging phase for everyone that made us worried. Pre-COVID life was as usual, with no sorts of disturbances, and the functioning of the people was usual. As COVID-19 started staggering, it was deeply shocking and astonishing to listen to the news, as it provides several deaths across the world. Every person must have their own story to pen down about their experiences and the lessons that they have learned from COVID-19.
I'm sure that all of you are quite moved by that, by the documentaries. We've received a whole lot of extraordinary documentaries which are very creative, and many others which unfortunately could not be recognized with some prizes, but of course they, as I assured you earlier, they'll definitely get light in the future as a part of the human rights cell's activities in the future. Well, good evening everybody. Now it is my pleasure to announce the official vote of thanks. We come to the final bit of these week-long events, and it is my greatest pleasure and duty to thank each one of you who have contributed to making it such a big success. I would really like to thank the guest speaker, Arvind Narayan, for accepting our invite and talking to us today on this very special occasion of the International Human Rights Day. On behalf of the St. Joseph's College of Law and the Human Rights Cell, I would like to thank Father Gerald D'Souza for his unending support to the cell in pursuing human rights causes passionately and courageously. His vision for the cell and the institution are only reflective of his deep sense of social concern and commitment. We are grateful to all that you do and all that you are, Father. Thank you. I would like to thank the principal, Ms. Pauline Priya, for her firm and graceful support towards the cell and its activities. Your reassurance in all our activities has been truly encouraging, ma'am. I would like to thank Vice Principal Dr. Sneha Balraj for her support and her help over all this time. I wholeheartedly and with the deepest of gratitude, I would like to thank the support staff, Balraj sir, Maxim sir, Yeshu sir, and everybody else who had stayed behind until the very end of these events. Your efforts are not visible on the forefront, but are simply what keeps us all going. Thank you, sir. I would like to thank Ms. Lindsay Joy Kuti, who is the co-teacher coordinator of the Human Rights Cell, for organizing this event with such efficiency and diligence. Last and simply never the least, I would like to thank all the students, especially the first years, who worked alongside me and put up with me for the last 2 weeks. Diksha Garg, Karthik SP, Mayin Mavra, Nandita Bharadwaj, Nikita Carolyn Prasad, Nitya, Parikshit Malye, Ria R. Mankar, S. Manasa, Sami Mohammed Farad, Sneha Samson, Vijay Shri, and Zoe Briswan Talkani. Without all of you, organizing this event would have been inconceivable. I apologize if I have missed out any names. It is completely unintentional, but nevertheless, thank you all for your contributions to our institution. I thank all the participants of the event for producing such creative and meaningful content and works of art. It is your work that is the most vital aspect of these events. I also would like to thank all our judges, from Thomas Alexander, Professor Tejaswini Yu, Abhimanyu Kumar, Mr. Abhimanyu Kumar, and Mr. Rohan Chinnappa, Mr. Vishnu T. Harikumar, Mr. Velu Shankar, and Mr. Subhash Babu for judging our events and putting the efforts to looking through all the submissions that had come forth. Again, congratulations to all the winners. May our prizes merely be a stepping stone for your greater future accomplishments. Thank you, everyone, especially all the participants who are here today, once again for being here. Thank you. I'm going to end the meeting unless anybody has any questions. There is a conversation that is happening parallelly. I am not going to stop that. We're all waiting to see you and we all miss you very much. All right, I will see you all very soon. Take care. I'm going to end the meeting, if that's all right.